Hello, and welcome to this clean historical Western romance by Martha Gilchrist. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gilchrist. The Rancher's Christmas Rose by Martha Gilchrist. Chapter 1. 5 Points, New York, August 1879. Emily Garcia slowly trudged home from her work, the sun beating down on her as the relentless heat made her even more weary than the pre-dawn start at the bakery. She kept her brown eyes focused on the ground in front of her, careful not to attract any unwanted attention from the drunks loitering outside the saloons. Her slim figure and womanly curves were well disguised by her plain gown, but she was exhausted with the heat and her long workdays, and didn't have the energy to deal with amorous gentlemen offering her a tot of whiskey in return for her affections. "Can you spare some coins for ale, ma'am?" A drunk stumbled into her path, his bleary eyes sliding past her. "No, sorry, I barely have enough to feed myself." She wrinkled her nose and sidestepped him, glancing around at the large gray tenement buildings surrounding her. Begging wasn't as bad as being pawed, but she couldn't help or even offer a single coin. Not when she was struggling to keep body and soul together already. Emily mostly kept herself to herself, especially in the neighborhood that they now lived in, 5 Points, which was known to be a rough area. The buildings themselves looked sad and depressing, and she knew all too well how crowded they were, having lived there for almost 3 years with her father. Life has changed so much. The 20-year-old sighed and allowed herself to think fondly of her old life before her mother had died, when they had lived happily in a beautiful, well-to-do part of town, where everyone was nice to each other, and she could walk with her head held high with no fear. It felt like a lifetime ago, a distant memory, but it was only just over 3.5 years since her mother, Louise, had died on Christmas Eve from yellow fever. Since then, her father had become a changed man. Such was the grief he felt from their loss. Up until that point, Isaac Garcia had been hard-working as a clerk for a garment manufacturing company. He enjoyed his work and excelled in it. His jovial nature meant he was liked by everyone he worked with, and he'd had a reputation for being firm but fair, and always kind and thoughtful of others. But Emily could hardly remember that man now. Following the death of her mother, he had changed, had taken to drinking too much and gambling, and had lost his job within 2 months, although Emily knew his boss had tried everything to get through to him and prevent that from happening, as had she. And here we are, struggling to make ends meet. What would Ma say if she could see us now? Emily whispered the words under her breath, looking up at the dilapidated tenement building where they rented rooms. She shuddered, in spite of the heat, at the thought of going in there. Her father had not worked a single day since he was let go from the manufacturing company, but kept up his habit of drinking and gambling. She could still remember the hot flush of shame when the bank had sent the bailiffs around to forcibly eject them from their comfortable home. "There's no fool like a man who favors drink above all else," one of the burly men had sneered, shaking his head with pity. Emily had jumped to her father's defense. It was easy to judge, but grief did strange things and hit people differently. "Never mind him," her pa had slurred. "I've secured us some cheap rooms in 5 Points. It won't be long until I'm back in a job again, and we can return to our old neighborhood." As Emily had pushed their meager belongings through the dusty streets on a handcart, somehow she knew they would never return. When they had first arrived, she had tried to be positive and grateful that they had a roof over their heads. She tried to convince herself that the local people would be just as friendly as where they had lived before, but Emily's friendly demeanor to people when she first arrived there was met with hostility. They were too well-to-do to fit in, and she finally gave up trying, mimicking most people's behavior by keeping her head down and not making any contact in this solitary and lonely place. "Out of the way," a woman dressed in rags grumbled, barging past her. "What are you standing there for anyway? blocking the way for us folks with somewhere to go, just trying to get home. Emily stumbled a few steps sideways and then jumped out of the way of an oncoming horse and cart. That was the trouble these days. She didn't feel like she had a home anymore. Not a proper one. Tears stung her eyes at the thought of going back in there. Her father was unpredictable these days, and she never knew what kind of mood he would be in. She had tried so desperately to be patient with him and to understand that the change in him was a result of his grief. But doesn't he realize I miss Ma too? He had barely acknowledged her grief, choosing instead to languish in his own self-pity. Her own grief had been made even more difficult by how her father had reacted. She felt the familiar worry build in her stomach as she thought about entering the dark building and climbing the dirty steps to the floor their apartment was on, the stench assailing her nose before she even got to the door. "Perhaps it would be better for me if I could work around the clock," she muttered. A rat scuttled out from under her feet, but it didn't even make her jump. She had gotten used to squalor and poverty. It had come to something that she preferred work to being at home. Although her job was tiring, she would much rather be there than in this place. She worked every hour that was available, telling her father it was so she could bring home as much money as she could, but secretly also wanting to be away from him and their ramshackle rooms as much as she could. Even working so many hours, it was a struggle to keep up with the rent and to put food on the table because Isaac demanded all her wages for drink and gambling, and she didn't have the strength or resolve to fight him. She had soon gotten wise to his demands, though, quickly learning that she needed to keep some money back for unforeseen expenses and food. Even when she'd had a small wage increase, she had never uttered a word about it to her pa. Instead, she hid the extra few coins away behind the clock on the dresser to build up nicely for a rainy day. "Why are you making such a racket? Can't a man get some peace and quiet around here to have a sleep?" Emily's heart sank as her father's booming voice echoed down the stairwell. It was ironic that he was demanding quietness from their neighbors, when it was usually him causing mayhem and arguing with anyone who caught his eye. It felt like she spent her whole life apologizing to the unfortunate families who lived next to them. "Oh, Pa, I wish you were asleep," she sighed under her breath. "Are you looking at me strangely?" His voice grew louder. "Don't you know I used to be a man people looked up to?" he roared. She could imagine the dark glitter of anger and resentment in his eyes. She hesitated on the bottom step. Hearing his shouting could only mean one thing. He was already drunk, fueled with anger over some imagined slight toward the neighbor, and itching to take his black rage out on her. She was used to being treated as little better than a lowly maid in their home, but when he was in this mood, he was unbearable to be around as his demands became more unrealistic. He would soon be demanding more alcohol, which she simply didn't have and had no means of getting. And then he would plead with her to go and place bets with money they didn't have. She knew she would be counting down the time until he finally fell asleep that evening. "Emily, is that you? Where's my dinner?" Isaac Garcia's slurred demands were bellowed from overhead, and she heard him shuffling along the hallway to look for her. Suddenly, something deep in her chest shifted. "I can't do this anymore." The thought took her by surprise, and she backed away from the stairs. "Perhaps I don't have to?" An even more intriguing thought. Before she could change her mind, she ran back out into the sunshine and hurried away. She didn't know where she would go, but she knew she could not go to their apartment right now. She couldn't face the inevitable. Chapter 2. After walking aimlessly for a few minutes, Emily decided she would go to the park and sit for a while to enjoy the shade of the trees and a few blessed moments of peace and quiet. The sight of abundant flowers and the leafy green trees made her think back to the park near her old home, where the lawns had been perfectly manicured and the flowers had been planted in neat rows. She wondered if she would ever go back to a world like that, or if she was now stuck here forever, caring for her father. Choosing a wooden bench that gave her a nice view where she could watch other couples strolling past, she loosened the ribbon of her bonnet and allowed the breeze to cool her neck as it rustled the leaves of the trees above her. Emily tilted her head back to enjoy the dappled shade on her face. Her eyes closed, long lashes flickering in the bright light. Her thoughts drifted, and she tried to imagine what her future might hold. Would she ever marry? How long could she bear the brunt of her pa's bad moods? Eventually, she lowered her gaze and pressed her hands together in her lap before praying for her life to change. Almighty God, I thank you for looking after me and for the blessing of having somewhere to live, for I know we are more fortunate than some. But I also ask for your guidance. Please help me find the strength to support my father through this terrible time and back to how he used to be before Ma died. Please help him to stop drinking and see sense again. We need to find a way out of this place, a way to get back to the kind of life we had before everything went wrong. I am so desperately sad in this place and yearn to be somewhere else, anywhere else. Please show me what I must do to find a better life. In your mercy, O Lord, Amen. A tear trickled down her cheek, so she quickly wiped it away as she opened her eyes and squinted into the low evening sunlight. As her eyes adjusted, she was surprised to see a gleaming carriage heading up the street toward the park. It looked strangely out of place, and she stood to get a better look and enjoy the sight of the kind of carriage she had been so accustomed to riding in. Although the park was in a better part of town than where she lived, it was unusual to see one, and she wondered idly who was in it. Perhaps it's someone I know from my past. Emily was suddenly torn. Did she want old acquaintances to see her threadbare gown and scuffed shoes? The carriage stopped abruptly at the entrance to the park, and Emily found herself holding her breath as the beautiful occupant climbed down and walked purposefully towards her. A smile on her pretty lips, Felicity Delmere. Emily was tempted to run away in shame, but it was too late. Emily Garcia, I thought it was you. I'd recognize your beautiful brown hair and elegant figure anywhere, Felicity declared, pulling Emily into a warm embrace. Emily could smell fresh lavender water on her silk gown and felt wholly ashamed of her own threadbare clothes and poorer hygiene, knowing what a state she must look. But Felicity seemed not to care. And she was delighted to see her friend after all this time, politely ignoring the clear difference between the two old friends. Felicity, this is a wonderful surprise. Emily suddenly found that she meant it. It was a rare treat to see someone who actually looked pleased to see her. What on earth are you doing here? She asked tentatively, gesturing for them both to sit on the bench together. The two young women had taken piano lessons together when she could still enjoy such luxuries before her mother had died. With hindsight, Emily wished she had treasured those moments more and had not taken them for granted, for now that they were gone, it was harder to remember those precious moments. She had heard that Felicity had married into a wealthy family of tea importers and now lived in a very nice part of town in a large brownstone house. She remembered now that her pa had told her about it, scowling with resentment, as though it was Emily's fault that she had ceased to be around the rich and elite and had deliberately refused the chance to marry well. I just dropped off a few of my maid's belongings at her parents' home. She has left now, and I wanted to get them back to her. And then I called out to my driver as I spotted you standing in this park. I knew it was you straight away. Still so beautiful, with those gorgeous brown curls and big brown eyes. Felicity's warm smile was infectious, and Emily felt unexpected pleasure being in her company again, as they chatted about their lives and what had changed since they last saw one another. I was so sorry to hear about your mother, Felicity said gently as her eyes filled with tears. I heard that your papa struggled to manage without her, which is how you came to move here. How is he doing now? She said cautiously as she glanced around them. Emily tried to push her shame aside as she saw the rundown area afresh through her friend's eyes. Felicity wasn't judgmental, which was a small mercy. Thank you for your condolences. Emily remembered how Felicity had always gotten along well with her mother. She gave her a rueful shrug. It's not so bad here once you get used to it, and I'm thankful I found work easily. She crossed her fingers under her apron, knowing it was bad to lie, but feeling too ashamed to express her fear and loneliness. Pa's not home at the moment. Otherwise, I would have taken you to see him. Losing Ma hit him hard, but he'll be back on his feet again in no time. Her stomach clenched as she saw disappointment in Felicity's eyes. I'm sure he would have loved to see you. Perhaps another time, she added. A vision of her pa's angry face and obnoxious rants slid into her mind, and she was relieved when Felicity nodded understandingly. Never mind. As you say, I'm sure we'll have another chance to meet again in the future. Felicity looked curious, but not enough to probe further. The pair smiled at each other, and Emily felt torn again. Part of her wanted to sit and talk to Felicity for hours, giving her a glimpse of a life that could have been hers had circumstances been different. But there was also a part of her that wanted to hasten her old friend's departure and wave her off as her carriage bore her away to her life of wealth and privilege. You know, Felicity began, my maid has just left me to travel west as a mail-order bride, marrying a man she has never even met, a saloon owner in California, no less. Fancy that. I suppose it's a good way for a young woman to have a new start far away. She sounded shocked and amused at the thought, but still smiled the beautiful smile that Emily had always loved, as it made her feel so appreciated. Anyway, now I'm in a quandary because I'm looking for a new reliable maid to help me. She gave Emily an earnest look. I know you're busy looking after your pa and already have a job, but I wonder if you know of anyone? She means me. Emily flushed and felt honored that her friend would offer to help her in this way, and it was tempting just to escape her current nightmare. But then a fresh wave of shame engulfed her. If she worked for Felicity, she would be an object of pity when the well-to-do folks she used to know saw her as a maid in servitude. And then there was the small matter of her pa. If he knew she was working for a wealthy family, it would only be a matter of time before he came calling to beg for money, or worse, to ask her to steal from them to fund his gambling. Felicity watched her closely, and Emily took a deep breath, deciding she couldn't reveal the full extent of her fall from polite society. I'm sorry, but I don't really know anyone around this area yet, so I wouldn't have anyone to recommend to you. A flash of confusion crossed Felicity's face, but then she smiled again. Well, really, I meant you, Emily. Would it be something you would be interested in? I know things must have been hard for you, and this gives you a way out. Felicity meant it kindly and sounded nervous, clearly not wanting to offend her. Thank you for asking, Felicity. I truly appreciate your kindness, but I cannot leave my father alone. He needs me, and we are okay here. She hoped her friend didn't feel uncomfortable at her rejection and wondered if she was doing the right thing. I understand. I expect you and your pa are closer than ever since you lost your mama. Please pass on my love to Isaac. It was so good to see you. We must catch up again soon. Felicity stood up and discreetly wiped the back of her dress in case any dust from the bench had stuck to her silk gown. I'd better go. It's a wrench leaving my dear husband when we're so in love. You'll find that out yourself too one day, Emily. She gave a tinkling laugh. Whoever marries you should count himself lucky. Are you courting already? Oh no, Emily blushed. There was no time in her day to even daydream about love, let alone think about finding a husband. Thank you again. It was kind of you to stop and talk and offer me the maid's position. Emily knew deep in her heart that, sadly, she would likely never see her friend again. Their lives were on different paths now, and she had to accept it. They embraced one last time before Felicity gracefully walked back to her carriage, where the coachman was waiting patiently. She stepped into the plush interior, and off she went, with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand through the window. Surprised by the unexpected encounter, Emily's mind wandered to what Felicity had told her about her maid becoming a mail-order bride. Could this be God's way of getting a message to me, just moments after I prayed about the future? She felt a wave of optimism as she allowed herself to daydream and hope for a better life for the first time in what felt like forever. She wondered if she could be brave enough to write to and then marry a rugged rancher out west, living a new life in nature instead of surrounded by gray buildings. She was filled with energy and jumped up from the bench. Hadn't her ma always told her that where there's a will, there's a way? Suddenly, she realized that she had allowed herself to get into a rut, thinking that her pa's decline was a burden she was stuck with for the rest of their days. But just because Pa chose to drink doesn't mean I have to live with his foul moods, she murmured to herself. What if I found myself a kind-hearted husband far away from here, like Felicity's maid? Picking up her skirts, Emily ran through the streets until she spied the newspaper stand on the corner of the square. Digging a couple of precious coins out of her apron pocket, she handed them over and quickly purchased the Matrimonial Times before she lost her nerve. After an adventure, are you? The newspaper vendor said, giving her a toothless smile. He pushed his grimy cap to the back of his head and nodded approvingly. I don't blame you. My wife's niece married a gold miner in California and said she wouldn't come back to 5 Points even if we paid her. She wondered why she'd ever left it so long. Emily glanced around, hoping that nobody was watching. Looking for a husband in the newspaper seemed desperate, but now she didn't feel so bad. Did it go smoothly? She whispered. How did she know he was the right gentleman to marry? The old man shrugged and scratched his ample belly thoughtfully. She said she just knew from how he described himself. He handed her a coin back. Use that to buy a hot dinner. I know your pa likes a drink. Seems you could do with something just for yourself. With that, he gave her a wink and turned to the next customer, and Emily hurried toward the tenement building. She would have a look at the advertisements later that night, when her father finally fell asleep in his drunken stupor, and pray that at least one would catch her eye. Chapter 3. 5 Points, New York, October 1879. Emily had a spring in her step as she walked the familiar route home from the bakery, even though the weather was becoming gloomier by the moment, with the cold biting at her toes through her worn boots. Regardless of the icy wind seeping in through her threadbare coat, she felt happy inside and optimistic about her future. And it's all because I think I'm falling in love. She smiled to herself as the words danced through her head, even though it had been an inauspicious start to a budding romance. Her thoughts turned back to that fateful night. The evening that she purchased the Matrimonial Times had been eventful when she returned to their apartment. Her pa had still been yelling at some poor neighbor who was doing everything to try to get away, and looked genuinely confused as to how it had all started in the first place. Emily understood that feeling with her father, so she had steered him away quickly, apologizing for his actions and words. The moment they had gotten through their door, her pa had turned on her. Don't ever let me catch you apologizing for me, girl, he boomed, as loud as she had ever heard him. He had stumbled whilst trying to take his shoes off until he fell to the floor, and she had to do it for him, still not daring to utter a sound and hoping to just get him in bed to sleep it off. Do you hear me? He yelled again, with renewed energy now that he had someone new to fight with. Yes, Pa, but it's not fair to take your temper out on the neighbors. We have to get along with them, remember? Being with Felicity had emboldened her to answer back for once. She felt sorry for the man Isaac had been railing against before she had returned. Then she felt guilty for leaving him and going to the park for some fresh air, while someone else had to put up with his tantrums. But she also wondered what she had done to deserve this life with him. She knew her ma would have been devastated if she had known what their lives had become, and it gave her renewed energy to change what she could. The thought of the Matrimonial Times folded up in her apron pocket had given her strength and hope. But she hadn't accounted for Isaac's mean streak when he had a belly full of cheap liquor. His eyes had narrowed, and he'd scrambled to his feet again, thrusting his face closer. Are you being rude to me, Emily? Your own father? When I speak, you should listen politely. And if I fall out with the neighbors, it's nobody's fault but theirs. You should be on my side. His voice had taken on a sullen tone. How come it's always someone else's fault? Emily had muttered under her breath. Because it is, Isaac had yelled, swaying from the effort of trying to stay upright. I swear you're trying to finish me off with scarcely a decent meal on the table each evening. I'm doing the best I can. The injustice of his accusations had cut Emily's heart like a knife. I work every hour, and you waste the money on drink and gambling, Pa. What more can I do? Isaac had shaken his head, still riled up with anger. Criticizing me again? That's all I ever hear from you, girl. One complaint after another. "Get out of my way, I'm going out." As Isaac had stumbled toward the door, he had shoved Emily aside, sending her sprawling over a chair, which had dug painfully into her ribs as she fell winded to the floor. "Pa, you've hurt me." Emily's words had barely been above a whisper, and she had gasped with pain, clutching her side. "Stop your sniveling. It's nothing that you don't deserve." Emily had stayed perfectly still, curled up on the floor in shocked silence, until her father had staggered to his bedroom instead of going out. As the dusty sunbeam crept across the floorboards, she soon heard him snoring loudly, oblivious to what he had just done to his own daughter. She had carefully got to her feet, holding her stomach to try to ease the pain, lying carefully on her narrow iron bedstead and crying hot tears of frustration and regret into her pillow. She knew the following morning her pa would be full of empty promises about it never happening again. He would declare it had been an accident. But her fear was that one day it would turn into more. Since her mother's passing, he had been vicious with his words many times, but he had never hurt her. Until tonight. It might not have been deliberate this time, but what about next time and the time after that? Emily had decided at that moment that she could not allow this to go on. She would find herself a new home and a new life, and she would get away from her father. She had done everything she could to help him, but it would never be enough. She couldn't do it for much longer, she was sure. The following morning, by the dim light of the rising sun, Emily had read through all the advertisements in the Matrimonial Times before she left for the long walk to the bakery. There had been no sign of movement in her father's bedroom, but she had crept through their apartment silently to avoid any risk of waking him, even though every movement hurt and a purple bruise had bloomed on her ribcage overnight. 3 advertisements had stood out to her, and without waiting a moment longer, Emily had quickly replied to them all in the hope that at least one of them might see something in her that would inspire them to continue writing. Her heart had been in her mouth as she hurried to the post office to send them with the last of her savings, each one accompanied by a silent prayer that it might be the start of something special. Much to her delight, Emily had received letters back from 2 gentlemen. One made it clear that he was only looking for a replacement for his wife, who had recently died, to take care of his unruly brood of children. But the other letter had filled her with excitement. Darren Hudson. Even now, several months later, Emily could remember the flutter of nerves and hope that had filled her chest when she'd received his first reply. The advertisement had been brief, but when he wrote back, he told her more about himself, and they had been exchanging letters regularly ever since. He was 26 years old, and he had described himself as dark-haired and tall. Emily thought his life seemed wonderfully different and exciting in Wyoming, at a small place called Crooked Hill, which sounded so quaint. He lived on a sprawling ranch with a generous-sized homestead and an array of barns, and there were lush green fields as far as the eye could see. It seemed almost like an enchanted land to her, immediately filling a yearning deep in her heart for a sense of belonging to a wholesome, kind family. At first, she couldn't help but wonder why a successful man like him would need to place an advertisement for a bride. She had even asked him in her first letter to him. But Darren had soon put her worries to rest with an endearing explanation. He wrote that he had realized he was spending all his time working, and although he lived happily with his brother Walter and their mother Audrey, he was lonely and yearned for a family of his own. With not many women in his part of the world, he had been persuaded by the owner of the local matrimonial agency to place an advertisement, hoping that at least one good woman would reply. Sure enough, he told her he'd been delighted to get a response from Emily, and the pair had shared many letters since, and now they had been writing to each other for months. She patted her apron as she walked, feeling the rustle of paper in her pocket, and her heart lifted with anticipation. Rather than getting the letters delivered to the apartment and risking her pa finding them, she always collected them from the post office, and she was already looking forward to reading this latest letter in the privacy of her bedroom later that night. One small relief was that Pa had been unusually quiet since the night he had knocked her over and caused the terrible bruising on her ribs. He still drank and gambled and argued with the neighbors, but it was as if he'd gone in on himself. Most evenings, he went out or mumbled incoherently at the table with his head resting on his arms, rousing himself only to demand food or money from her. It was a sorry way to live, but that evening had finally given her the strength to see things for what they were. Her Pa was never going to change, and she needed to break free. She was ready to go as soon as a proposal came from Darren, which she hoped would be soon. As she walked the remainder of her journey, she kept her eyes on the ground, avoiding looking at the dreary buildings around her, and lapsed into her new favorite pastime of thinking about Darren and his life out west. He sounded like such a kind-hearted gentleman, and she could still scarcely believe her luck that they were writing to each other. He had told her in his letters that he looked after their loving mother, Audrey, as she was getting older and needed care. He had also said that he donated money to the local church and the school in Crooked Hill, as he wanted to help his community. "I'm not rich by some folks' estimations, Emily," he had said, "but we have more than enough money to get by, so I like to share some of my wealth with friends and neighbors." It was such a stark contrast to Isaac's grasping hands, taking her wages off her as soon as she got home to go gambling, that Emily was already full of admiration for Darren. "Pa, are you home?" Emily's call was half-hearted as she pushed the apartment door open, and she breathed a sigh of relief when there was no reply and no sound of drunken snoring. She knew that, most likely, he was at a saloon, drinking and gambling, and that he would return slurring and angry later, but at least she had some time to herself to make the most of the peace and quiet. She would worry about his moods later, or better still, she would go to bed early and leave a cold dinner out for him to eat alone. She threw off her shawl and bonnet and sat on her rickety old bed. Sighing with happy anticipation, Emily lit a candle and took the letter from her pocket. She was equally excited and impatient to know what Darren had to say this time. "Dearest Emily, thank you for your letter. I enjoyed reading it, and thank you for telling me a little more about your father. It is desperately sad that he lost his wife, but you lost your mother too, and you don't deserve to take the brunt of his drinking. I hope you won't think me too bold, but I want to declare my intentions to you. I believe I have fallen in love with you, Emily, and I would dearly like for us to marry and start our own family. I think we have gotten along very well in our letters, and I believe we could be very happy as we grow old together. I would be honored if you would agree to become my wife and accept the enclosed money for a railroad ticket for you to travel to Wyoming. It will be a long journey, but I'll be waiting to collect you and take you to our home near Crooked Hill. We can marry right away, so you have no fear of me putting you in a compromising position. The station master told me there are regular trains running west from New York, so if you do decide to accept my proposal, I hope you will come as soon as possible after you've packed up your belongings and said farewell to your father. I shall look forward to your letter of confirmation as patiently as any man can when waiting to hear the fate of his future. I pray you will accept, and I hope to be collecting you from the local station in Wyoming in just a few weeks. Yours sincerely, Darren." Emily stared at the letter, reading the words over and over, her smile becoming wider each time until she couldn't hold back her joy any longer, and she twirled around her cramped bedroom. Suddenly, the whine of the cold breeze trickling through the thin walls, or the fact that her legs ached from standing behind the counter of the bakery all day, didn't matter anymore. "I'm free," she sang. "Darren will be my husband, and we'll have years of happiness ahead of us." Her only regret was that her ma wasn't alive to help her prepare. Chapter 4. Emily heard the nearby clock outside chime the hour and came back to her senses, carefully folding the letter again and placing it back into her apron pocket for safekeeping. She was hungry and wanted to get the meal made and eaten so she could return to her room before Isaac returned from the saloon. She hummed as she chopped a few meager vegetables to stretch the stew, which had lasted several days already. the smile never leaving her face as she dreamt about the new life she was about to live. When the odd pang of guilt threatened to tarnish the moment, she pushed it away. Would Ma have wanted me to give up my chance of happiness to look after Pa forever? This might be my only opportunity to get married. The thoughts were unsettling, so she contemplated the journey instead. She had never even been on a train, let alone by herself. What clothes might she need? Would she make a few friends on her way? Suddenly, the door crashed open, bringing with it a gust of icy air that made her shiver. Isaac made no attempt to close the door after him or greet her as he stumbled to the table and sat heavily on his chair, slumping his head dramatically onto the table. She hurried past him to quickly close the door again and returned to the stove, keeping her back to him, hoping he would just fall asleep with his head just where it was. "What are you cooking?" he slurred behind her. "And why are you looking so happy? There's nothing to be happy about in this hovel. And that dress of yours looks a mess. Don't you care about looking tidy?" His voice rose as he spoke, and the venom in his tone sent shivers down her spine. Emily looked down at her dress. It was the same one she had worn many times, so she didn't know why he was mentioning it now. She knew it had some holes, and she needed to mend them, but with working so much, she simply hadn't had the time. She tried to ignore his hurtful words, which just kept on coming, whilst she stirred the stew, praying that it would cook quickly so he could eat and sober up a bit. "I'm fed up with you always cooking the same thing. You never listen to me. You'll never be as good as my Louise." Emily gasped as she turned to face her father, shocked that he had even mentioned her mother's name. She hadn't heard him utter it since her mother's passing. He stared her straight in the eyes. "You are nothing but a millstone around my neck, woman." He scowled blearily and lay his head back on his arms again. Emily felt tears sting her eyes, but refused to let them escape. "I won't let Pa ruin my secret." She served the stew in 2 bowls and placed his in front of him, sitting opposite with her own, but it was too late. The delight she had felt earlier about Darren's proposal felt like a distant memory already. She was so conflicted about what to do. She wanted to get away, but loyalty toward her Pa ran deep. She surreptitiously watched him as he scooped up some of his stew, spilling it on the way to his mouth. In the dim lamplight of the kitchen, he looked old and haggard, and the thought of leaving him made Emily turn cold. She was all he had in the world. Perhaps they should stick together, she thought. She wondered idly whether she could write to Darren and ask if her Pa could travel west with her. Maybe a fresh start on the ranch would give him something to sober up for. Her musings were shattered by a loud hammering on the door. "Are we expecting visitors?" Isaac mumbled. Emily jumped up quickly to open the door, her stomach clenching as she saw Isaac's face start to turn red with anger at the interruption during his dinner. "Mr. Hurd, how can I help you?" Her heart started to thud at the sight of their landlord standing in the hallway. He had a mulish expression on his face and didn't bother with niceties. "You're home at last," he snapped. "I need the last 2 months' rent. I've been calling by for days, but your lazy father never opens the door to me." 2 months' rent?" she echoed. "Pa has been paying the rent. I think there must be some mistake." She turned to look at her father, who was now slumped back in his chair, his head lolling back as though about to fall asleep. "Pa, you've kept up with paying Mr. Hurd, right?" Isaac's grim chuckle made her heart sink. "Waste of money, paying for a hovel like this," he mumbled. "I'd rather spend it on whiskey than line that crook's pockets." He raised his hand weakly and pointed at Hurd before shaking his head and chuckling again. "But how could you do this, Pa?" It was no good, and she groaned inwardly. She only had herself to blame. She had given her father the money to pay the rent, trusting that he wouldn't be foolish enough to fall behind. But he must have spent it on drinking and gambling instead. "It seems that if anyone's the crook, it's your father, Miss Garcia." Mr. Hurd's face darkened with contempt as he stared at Isaac, who was mumbling to himself and grinning without a care in the world. He shrugged. "It changes nothing, though. I need that rent money," he said coldly. "I don't have it at the moment, sir. We don't have any spare money." She was desperate for him to understand. "I'll save up and work longer hours, I promise. Please show some leniency." Mr. Hurd shrugged again and gave her a thin smile. You're already 2 months behind, and I've been more than patient. You work at the bakery, don't you? I know the owner, so I've decided I'll take your rent money off your wages. That way your father can't drink it all away, he declared triumphantly. Emily's mouth gaped open with horror. But Mr. Hurd, that is all the money that we have coming in. How will we eat? How will I keep our rooms warm? You'll barely leave me with enough to survive if you do that. Please, have mercy on us. I'm doing the best I can. You're too lenient on your father. That's the problem. It's about time he learned that other folks need to make a living. We can't all spend the day at the saloon, can we, Miss Garcia? Without another word, their landlord strode away. Emily looked at her father as she closed the door. He had finished his stew and was now smiling in her direction, as though he had done nothing wrong. In fact, he even looked proud of his actions. "What will we do, Pa?" she asked. "Look what a mess you've gotten us into." Her dreams of marriage felt as though they were in tatters. She couldn't leave her father in such a terrible state. If she went, there would be no money coming in. How would he live, she wondered. "Stop being so weak, girl. He already said what he's going to do." Isaac stood from his chair and stepped towards her, swaying slightly. "You'll just have to work longer hours or find a second job for the nights." "How can I? Who will cook and clean if I'm never here? You don't do anything to help." She shivered, feeling intimidated as he loomed over her. "Whose fault is that?" he spat. "You hardly earn anything at the bakery." His hands balled into fists, and Emily instinctively shrank from him. Has it come to this? Pa beating me? Isaac suddenly gasped and looked down at his hands, sorrow and guilt clouding his face for a fleeting moment. "This isn't right. I just want life to go back to how it was. I just want Louise." He grabbed his coat and wrenched open the door, stumbling down the stairs and back into the night, where he would undoubtedly go back to the saloon for more drink. As silence settled around her, Emily knew that this was the end of the road for her and her father. If she stayed, he would do something that neither of them would ever recover from. Part of her felt sorry for him. It was the drink that had erased the man he used to be, her loving father, who used to carry her proudly on his shoulders when she was a small child. She would accept Darren's proposal, and she wouldn't look back. And to protect herself, she wouldn't even tell her father she was going. Emily rushed to her bedroom and pulled out her small carpet bag, stuffing it with the essential things she needed, as well as her meager savings from the hiding place on the dresser. She wrapped herself in her winter cape and lay fully clothed on her bed. The safest time to leave would be in the dead of night when Isaac was fast asleep. She lay looking at the ceiling in the darkness and turned to the comfort of prayer. "Dear Lord, please look after Pa and help him find the peace his soul needs. I pray that one day we might be reunited. Give me the strength to make the journey west to marry Darren. Amen." 3 hours later, when the only creatures stirring in the inky darkness were rats scuttling under the floorboards, Emily closed the door of the apartment behind her for the final time. She tiptoed down the stairs and headed for the solace of the local church. Knowing she would be safe there for the night, she would write to Darren and pay extra for the letter to go on the Pony Express the following morning to let him know she would be on the next train. As she glanced up at the apartment window, sadness coursed through her that she hadn't said goodbye to her father, and she would probably never see him again. But what made her sadder was that Isaac was not the man she knew as her father. He had changed beyond recognition, and all she could do was hope that he would find salvation one day from the Lord instead of the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Chapter 5. Blackford and Crooked Hill, Wyoming. Steam billowed in the air as the train slowly pulled into Blackford, Wyoming, the nearest town to Crooked Hill with a railroad station. Emily's thoughts wandered to her father, as they had many times on her journey. She knew he must have been worried about her when she didn't come home after work the day after leaving. But she pushed the guilt from her mind and focused on the moment. In the end, a sense of loyalty had prompted her to leave him a note propped up on the dresser explaining she was heading west to be a mail-order bride. It helped ease her guilt a little. But it was only now that she had gotten away that she realized how much she had been treading on eggshells all the time. I haven't felt fear about my pa's unpredictable behavior once on the journey. It was surprisingly refreshing. She didn't miss the snide digs about her efforts, or knowing that whatever she did for him, it would never be good enough. Not now that he was so different, and she knew that if she had remained in that situation, he would have dragged her down with him, and they would both end up destitute. She had done what she could to help him, and he had chosen not to change. She closed her eyes for a moment, thinking fondly of the earlier days when her ma was still alive and they were all happy. That's the man I shall remember. A loud hoot blasted out from the engine up front, snapping her back to the present, and suddenly nerves fluttered in her stomach. Darren had told her in his letters that it was around an hour's journey to his ranch, which they would travel to in his wagon. Her mind was already full of questions. Would the wagons be the same as in 5 Points? What would his first words to her be? Are you ready to meet your new husband, dear? Exciting times, I'm sure. A kindly older woman patted her on her shoulder as she squeezed past, and Emily nodded. Ready to disembark, ma'am? The conductor pointed toward the door, and Emily gripped her carpet bag tightly, preparing to leave the carriage that had become a strange sort of home for her over the last few days. Careful on the steps. A porter grabbed her bag and held out his hand politely to help her down, and she accepted gratefully as she stepped onto the platform and brushed the creases out of her dress. She wanted to look her best for Darren, although she feared she looked crumpled and grimy after the long journey. Your bag, ma'am, he reminded her. He placed it by her feet on the dusty ground and tipped his cap. She wasn't used to such kindness. Thank you. Thank you so much. She gushed as she smiled at the gray-haired man. With her feet firmly planted on the ground and her belongings by her side, Emily glanced around all of the people on the platform, eagerly searching for the tall, dark-haired gentleman named Darren Hudson. There were many people coming and going, but no one paid her any attention, and no one seemed to be looking for her. Her stomach started to do somersaults as she recalled what some of the women on the train had told her all about how some mail-order brides traveled to a new life only to find themselves left alone, with nowhere to go. What if I have come all this way and abandoned Pa, and Darren has forgotten to pick me up? Or worse, changed his mind. Her thoughts skittered from one disastrous scenario to the next. She didn't have enough money to get to the ranch, and certainly not to return to 5 Points on the train. I'm doomed. She felt her throat constrict with worry. He'll be along soon, ma'am. The porter grinned as he hurried past. Nobody would leave a pretty young woman like you waiting long. She felt her worries ease slightly and nodded politely. She was getting carried away with herself. It would be okay. Perhaps the train had even arrived a little early. She tried to push the fear from her mind and be confident that he would arrive at any time. But still, where was he? The crowds of people dissipated, giving her a clearer view of the folks still on the platform. Not one of the men had dark hair, as he had described. Another shiver of alarm gripped her when she suddenly heard a voice behind her. Miss Garcia? The deep voice inquired. She turned around and found herself confronted by a broad-shouldered man, half a head taller than her, with a genuine and kind smile that spread slowly across his tanned face. His eyes were as blue as she had ever seen, and as he lifted his wide hat politely, it revealed tousled blonde hair. He had an easy way about him that she was instantly reassured by. Emily Garcia? He asked again. Uncertainty clouded his eyes briefly as she struggled to find her voice. Oh, yes, but how do you know my name? She asked cautiously. It was all very well to find him attractive, but she reminded herself that she'd heard about bandits and cattle rustlers, and the man who stood before her looked nothing like Darren's description of himself. Had he lied? Who are you? She realized it sounded blunt. I mean, are you Mr. Hudson? Darren Hudson? The man shook his head, and his eyes crinkled at the corners, making him look like the least likely candidate to be a bandit, much to her relief. He looked amused as he replied. Apologies, Miss Garcia. Let me explain. First, welcome to Wyoming. He spread his arms out as though he was able to show her the whole of the place with this one gesture. She couldn't help but smile back at him and his enthusiasm for the place. My name is Ben Jackson. He said it confidently, as though he expected her to know of him. "Nice to make your acquaintance, but I think we may be a little mixed up here because, like I said, I'm waiting for Mr. Darren Hudson." Emily hoped she hadn't offended the man who seemed so determined to make her feel welcome. But she had to bear in mind the cautionary tales she'd heard whispered on the train about strangers whisking mail-order brides away, and she didn't know anyone out west. His smile grew even broader, although there was a hint of something else in his expression. Was it pity or awkwardness, she wondered. "Let me start again. I guess I'm not very good at these introductions." He twisted his hat in his big hands. "I'm Darren's cousin, Ben. He sent me to fetch you from the train and take you to the ranch. Darren is a very busy man, and he doesn't really like traveling, so he usually sends me on errands." "Oh, I see." Emily tried to hide her disappointment. She had expected a warm welcome in person from her husband-to-be, and it seemed rather strange to send someone else to collect her on his behalf, even if that someone was handsome and kind. "I thought Darren would be here, but I suppose I have a lot to learn about ranching. He certainly said in his letters that he's busy. Thank you for your welcome, though. I'll have you back at the ranch in no time." Ben picked up her bag and gestured toward the exit from the platform. "I've done a few errands in town, and we can leave right away unless there's something you need to buy while we're here." She shook her head. There would be plenty of time to explore the local area and come back to Blackford with Darren. Now that she was here, she didn't want to prolong the moment of meeting her fiancé. She followed Ben to the wagon, where he stowed her bag next to some fence posts and held his hand out to help her up to her seat. "Thank you," she murmured as he helped her up onto the wooden seat. Someone had thoughtfully provided a blanket to go over her knees. Darren, no doubt. She tucked it around her, grateful for the warmth and thinking that she would thank him later. "I hope you don't mind that it's a little dusty," Ben said with a rueful smile. "It's a blanket I keep out in the barn for nights when I'm keeping watch on the animals, but it was all I had to hand." He picked up the reins and urged the big gray horse to trot on, and Emily felt another ripple of disappointment. So Darren hadn't thought she might be cold? "It's because he's so busy," she reminded herself. "Next stop, Crooked Hill, and then your new home." Ben held her gaze for a moment. "I hope you'll like it." The tree-clad mountains seemed to go on forever, as far as the eye could see, and Emily felt a sense of awe take over her emotions as the landscape unfolded in front of them. It was more stunning than she could ever have imagined, and nothing in her lifetime of living in New York could have prepared her for so much splendor. Her heart lifted as she drank in the palette of vivid fall colors. It was almost dazzling enough to make her feel giddy with delight. "Mr. Jackson, this is so beautiful," she exclaimed. "The colors are so bright, and the air is clean and fresh. And look at all those cattle. They look so content to be outside grazing." She pointed delightedly to one side of the wagon, then the other, hardly knowing where to look first. Ben shrugged his shoulders, seemingly accustomed to his surroundings. "It's all I have ever known, but when you put it like that, you're right. It is beautiful." He swept his arm wide, taking everything in, and shot her a wry smile. "I'm usually busy thinking about errands and keeping my eyes on the road, so I guess I don't appreciate it enough. You're reminding me not to take this for granted, which can only be a good thing." He slowed the horse for a moment and allowed himself the luxury of really looking at the views, nodding in appreciation. "But please, Miss Garcia, do call me Ben. I'm just a humble ranch hand, and I'm not used to such formality." Emily felt her cheeks turn pink. Was it the cold wind or the company? "Me neither," she confided. "If I'm to call you Ben, you must call me Emily." Her heart sank as he instantly shook his head vigorously. "Sorry, Miss Garcia, but that's not possible. My cousin would disapprove of such familiarity, particularly when you have just arrived. You'll be Mrs. Hudson soon enough." There was a hint of regret in his voice. "Then it will be up to Darren to decide what's appropriate. He likes to keep his workers respectful." Emily thought for a moment about how to respond to that. She was surprised that Darren could be that demanding and bossy toward his cousin when he had seemed so lovely in his letters. She wondered if Ben was just being overly cautious and didn't want to cause any potential problems. Well, I do approve, and it's my name, so I would prefer for you to call me Emily. I don't know anyone here, and it would be really good to have a friend, but friends don't speak to each other so formally, do they? She quipped. So, Emily it is. She lifted her chin and folded her hands in her lap to indicate that the decision had been made and she would hear no more of it. If you're sure, but maybe not in front of Darren. Ben's smile had waned a little, and he looked nervous. Again, Emily wondered whether she had somehow misjudged Darren. Surely he would treat his cousin like an equal and be glad she had made friends with someone in his family already. She would get to the bottom of it once she arrived. They chatted with ease for the next half hour as the horse clopped along in front of their wagon. Emily explained that she hoped she would settle in well and get to know people quickly. I'm looking forward to Darren teaching me all about ranch life. I want to help as much as I can, she declared, determined to earn her keep. Ben's eyebrows twitched up in surprise as he glanced over at her before he returned his eyes to the track ahead of them with nothing more than a mumbled agreement. Does he think that me working on the ranch is a ludicrous idea? Will Darren have the time and inclination to help me learn? More questions buzzed around her head, but she decided not to probe him as she didn't want to put him in an awkward situation, so she stayed off the topic. I'm only sorry that my ma didn't live long enough for me to write to her about how beautiful Wyoming is. She would have loved it here, she added. And Pa would too. Except he would end up insulting Darren, and I can't afford for that to ever happen. Ben's eyes were kind as he listened. It must be hard leaving everything you've ever known behind, and there's so much more to see yet. Just wait until I show you the cattle and the horses at Oak Ranch, Ben exclaimed. His eyes lit up, and his pride was evident in his voice. But then he suddenly checked himself. Until Darren shows you, I meant. Oak Ranch? She inquired. She realized Darren had never told her the name of his property. In fact, we're just reaching the boundary now, and those are our cattle in the fields. He gestured toward a herd of cattle. They fetch some of the best prices in the district, and I like to breed them to be easy to handle as well. Placid animals make the best livestock. Emily noticed how his eyes gleamed with enthusiasm when he talked about the ranch, and he didn't speak down to her, making her feel foolish for not knowing much about ranching like some men might have done. I'm no expert, but they look mighty fine to me. You must work hard and enjoy it. As Ben pointed out more landmarks and told her about the animals, Emily's earlier misgivings disappeared. She could tell he was a kind-hearted man, which gave her hope that Darren must surely be the same. There was nothing to worry about, and nothing to read into the fact that he hadn't bothered to travel to Blackford to fetch her. There you are, the Oak Ranch homestead. They rounded a corner in the track, and Ben pointed ahead to a large 2-story house with generous verandas wrapped around, and numerous barns and corrals. The house is huge, she exclaimed, hardly able to believe her eyes. Emily thought back to the cramped apartment she had left behind and suddenly felt like an imposter. I'll never fit in here if Darren owns all this. She twisted the edge of the rug over her knees, resisting the urge to ask Ben to turn the wagon around and leave immediately. This is all Darren's? She gulped. Yes, it's pretty impressive, Ben agreed. Darren and his family are very well off and blessed to have this home and so much prime land. She wondered if she detected some unease in his voice. Was Ben jealous? The place was undeniably stunning. Surely you include yourself in the family as his cousin? The question was on the tip of her tongue, but Ben's expression had become closed, as though he didn't want to talk anymore. She thought about the letters she and Darren had shared, and although he had mentioned that he was wealthy, she had never gotten the impression that it was this kind of wealth. She couldn't help but wonder if she would fit in and whether she would be good enough for them. She thought about the life she had just escaped from and considered the contrast between that and what she had arrived at. This is far too good for me, she muttered awkwardly. She felt embarrassed as she realized Ben had heard. Nothing is too good for you, Miss Garcia, he said firmly. His eyes crinkled with another smile that seemed slightly sad. If anything, you're too good for them. You're perfect. This second part was added so quietly that Emily wasn't sure if she'd imagined it. "Let me hitch the wagon and help you down," he said louder, suddenly more businesslike. Emily felt self-conscious as the ranch door opened, and 3 people hurried out onto the veranda to watch. There were 2 men, who looked to be in their mid-50s, and an older lady with gray hair pulled back into an unflattering bun. Strange. Darren didn't mention that there were so many people here. She wondered if they were his aunts and uncles, or a housekeeper and 2 ranch hands, although they looked too well dressed for the latter. Shaking out her dress, Emily shyly looked at the house and barns, hoping against hope to see Darren come striding around the corner, full of apologies for not picking her up. Ben put her bag on the floor and shook hands with her. "Thank you for all your help," she murmured. She couldn't quite meet his eyes for fear of her blush returning, as she thought about his previous words about her being perfect. "It's no trouble." He cleared his throat. "Well, I have to go, Miss Garcia. It was very nice to make your acquaintance, and I'm sure I'll see you around over the next few days. I need to go and unhitch the wagon and feed this horse." With that, Ben grabbed the horse's harness and clicked his tongue, leading the horse and wagon away, leaving Emily wondering what on earth she should do next. She wanted to run after him to ask where Darren was. And why are the people on the veranda looking at me so intently? A prickle of embarrassment gripped her. They were staring at her, but not in a kind way. Eventually, just as Ben disappeared from view, one of the men strolled down the veranda steps and walked toward her. He had gray, thinning hair and a paunch. As he got closer, she could see his face was lined with the thin red veins that she knew all too well from her father as a result of his heavy drinking. The man's build was overweight rather than muscular, and his hands were pale and soft. Nothing like a rancher who works outside all day, she realized. If only Darren would hurry up and make an appearance. It was starting to feel rude and ill-mannered, leaving her to face these older relatives of his all alone. "Hello, I'm Emily Garcia," she said nervously as she shook his hand politely. It felt limp in her grasp, but she smiled nonetheless. "I'm here to meet with Darren Hudson. We're getting married. You must be Darren's uncle, or perhaps his father." She winced, cross that she might be mistaken. He'd never mentioned his father in his letters, so she had assumed he had died. The man looked her up and down with a bold gaze, then broke into wheezing laughter. "She's here to meet Darren," he chuckled, mimicking her. "She thinks I'm his uncle." His laughter grew louder as the other man on the veranda joined in. "Isn't that the funniest thing I've heard today? His uncle?" The second man shook his head, and his lip curled with disdain. "Are you going to tell her, or shall I?" Emily glanced back at the middle-aged man in front of her, feeling more confused by the minute. "Have I gotten something wrong?" "Not really." He grinned again. "I'm Darren Hudson, and this is my brother, Walter, who I told you about, and our wonderful ma, Audrey." But you said you're 26 years old." Emily's voice was hoarse with shock, but this only seemed to amuse Darren even more. He shrugged. "Nobody tells the complete truth in those mail-order bride letters, do they?" he stated flatly, as though lying was completely normal. "But you should be honest," Emily whispered, still in shock. "Everything else is true." His voice sounded cold as he gestured to the rolling landscape, checkered with fields and the impressive homestead. "Isn't this enough for you, Miss Garcia? A young woman from the grimy streets of New York? Seems to me you've done well for yourself from where I'm standing." Emily opened her mouth to speak again, but then swallowed her words. "What's the point? What choice do I have now I'm here?" He didn't offer to pick up her bag, so she grabbed it and trailed after him. She shivered with regret as it dawned on her that she had made a terrible mistake. The man she had been writing to had indeed lied to her. Far from the energetic, handsome young gentleman she had imagined, Darren was about the same age as her father. And that wasn't the only similarity, judging by the waft of stale whiskey coming from him. Why have I traveled all this way to escape my pa, just to end up with the same fate, but with a stranger and his family? It was a disheartening thought, and she hoped she was wrong. Chapter 6. Ben couldn't help but frown as he unhitched the wagon and led the horse into a stable to be rubbed down and fed. He tried to close his ears to the conversation behind him, but it was impossible, and he found himself dawdling over the task, wanting to hear more. Not that he had to strain to hear. Darren's confident, entitled voice boomed out as he introduced himself to Emily between chuckles of mirth. When Walter joined in laughing as well, Ben felt a hard lump of anger form in his chest. Glancing over at the scene, anyone could see Emily's confusion and upset etched on her beautiful face. How could Darren be so cruel, he muttered to himself. As if I need to ask, it's just his normal demeanor. Ben thought back over the strange day as he started brushing the horse in long, sweeping strokes. It had come as a complete surprise to discover that Darren had been corresponding with anyone. Darren had ambled over to the barn that morning and instructed him to go and collect a mail-order bride for him from the nearest train station. Ben had complied, of course, wondering curiously what the woman would be like. He'd assumed she would be around the same age as Darren, carefully watching each passenger disembark and looking for someone who fitted the image he'd painted in his head. Gray hair, perhaps a little matronly looking. He'd waited and waited until the only person left who it could be was a slim young woman with glossy brown curls and a shy expression. It had taken all his willpower not to look shocked as he introduced himself to Miss Garcia. Emily Garcia. He savored her name under his breath, shaking his head slightly at how blindsided he'd been. Ben closed the stable door and absent-mindedly forked some hay into a feed rack, his thoughts still very much on their journey back to Oak Ranch. He was full of misgivings on her behalf. Emily had talked enthusiastically, but he sensed a certain veil of reticence as well. He could tell that the previous years since her ma had passed away had been difficult. He wondered whether she was trying to escape from something in her past. Or someone? He got the feeling it wasn't a romance she was running from, though, as she seemed innocent in matters of the heart. He chewed his lip, wondering if he should have asked more. But it wasn't his nature to pry. Everyone had their secrets. The closer they had gotten to the ranch, the more Ben had wanted to tell her that there must have been a terrible mistake. How could she possibly want to marry his brutish, thoughtless cousin Darren? A tender flower like her? Several times he'd almost blurted out the question. His head had filled with emotions he wasn't used to, and he was consumed by an urge to protect her from Darren and Walter. And now he felt guilty, as though he had been unwittingly part of their deceit by not warning her in time. He loitered in the barn doorway, watching Emily being introduced to Walter and Audrey, and allowed himself free rein for one wonderful moment to think about having her as his sweetheart. He'd never really had the time or the inclination for romance. There had been a few young ladies he chatted politely to at church, and he'd attended some dances in Crooked Hill. But there was never anyone special. Nobody had ever made his heart beat faster like this, the way that Emily had the moment he had laid his eyes on her. Traveling next to her in the wagon, he had surreptitiously observed how her long brown hair shimmered in the fall sunlight, as though it had gossamer threads of copper running through it. When she had first turned to him, he had quite forgotten what he was saying as he saw her dewy complexion with pink cheeks that reminded him of spring flowers, and her lips the color of ripe cherries. He had thought she was enchanting from that very moment, which was why it was so painful to know that she was promised to Darren of all people. "You've done well there, brother." Walter's coarse comment drifted across the barnyard, making Ben wince. Even from this distance, he could see the troubled emotions chasing across Emily's face and how she lowered her eyes as if she wished she could be somewhere else. She has no idea what she's getting herself into. It was a wretched thought because Ben knew only too well. Emily was in for a huge disappointment, that was for sure. Suddenly he decided he couldn't stand idly by and do nothing. He had to say something. But what? If he waited in, Darren might throw him off the ranch, and then Emily wouldn't have a single ally. He gritted his teeth and paced back and forth, trying to figure out how he could get her out of this situation in a way that wouldn't cause Darren's bad temper to erupt. Perhaps he could persuade his cousin that Emily was too young, that he needed a more experienced woman. Before he had the chance to head for the homestead, he saw that Darren was walking over with a glowering expression. He stopped in front of Ben and prodded him in his chest. I hope you're not thinking of stepping out of line, young Ben. This is not your business, and Emily isn't yours to be concerned about. I only asked you to collect her for me." His eyes were full of spite. "She's a pretty little thing, but you need to remember your place in this family." There was no mistaking the menace in his words. Darren loved nothing more than reminding Ben that he only lived there as a charitable gesture. He could be thrown out without a reference at any time. "I'm just surprised you'd want to marry someone half your age." Ben leaned on his pitchfork, determined not to back down. He'd done it too many times, and Emily deserved better. "I don't pay you to have opinions or to fawn over her. You're here to work with the animals, and that's where it ends. Do we understand each other?" Ben's hand clenched, and he ground out an agreement. "Uh-huh. I understand what you want. Perfectly." His reply was ambiguous, but Darren was too full of his own importance to realize. "Good. Be sure and keep it that way. Emily will soon be glad I chose her. Besides, what's she going to do otherwise? Run away?" He chuckled and kicked out at one of the farm cats, which had gotten too close, sending it scurrying away with a howl of indignation. "There's no need for that," Ben snapped. He bit back the rest of what he wanted to say as Darren shrugged and gave him a malevolent glare. Ben realized then that he was just going to have to keep his mouth shut. As much as he didn't like his cousins and aunt, he did love the ranch, and he needed to be there. He promised himself he would pray that Emily wouldn't have a bad time in her marriage with Darren, and he would do what he could to help her not feel the way he did, that he was trapped at Oak Ranch with the Hudsons. "Get back to work," Darren growled before he stalked back to the homestead. Ben watched him approach Emily, and he felt anger curl in his belly at her situation. It reminded him too much of when he'd first arrived. He'd been just 12 years old, and his parents had died suddenly. Ben's Aunt Audrey had agreed to take him in rather than see him become an orphan, and he had lived with them ever since. But life with the Hudson family was difficult, and from the moment he had arrived, he had been expected to work tirelessly on the ranch to earn his keep. He loved the land and enjoyed working with the cattle, but they made sure he barely earned enough to save any money. One day, he mused, his dream was to have his own ranch, but as the years rolled by, he started to doubt whether he would ever get away from the family. Audrey's husband, Graham, had been the rancher with all the knowledge and had taught Ben well, and since his passing, it was Ben who did the lion's share of the work. Without him, Darren and Walter would struggle. They liked to brag about Oak Ranch and the prize-winning animals, but none of it was from them getting their hands dirty. All they were interested in was good living off the profits from the ranch. Many times, Ben had longed to break free and set up something of his own, but he could never afford it. So instead, he reminded himself that he was grateful to have a roof over his head and food on the table each night. And now that Emily had arrived, he had even more reason to remain. He had a feeling she might need a friend once she was married to Darren, or, at the very least, he would look out for her as best he could once she was in the family's clutches. Emily slowly walked up the steps of the veranda, and her palms felt clammy as she approached Audrey. She glanced across at the barn, where she saw Ben going about his chores, and was surprised at the sudden longing she had to run across the yard and be by his side again. She had felt comfortable with him, unlike the new family she was about to become a part of. "Good day to you, Mrs. Hudson." She bobbed a polite curtsy to Audrey, who had watched her arrival with seeming disinterest. She reminded herself quickly that Darren had told her in his letters that his ma was a kind-hearted, sweet old lady. Perhaps her first impression was wrong. "It's wonderful to finally get here and meet you." Audrey pressed her lips together in a thin line and looked her up and down with a sour expression that made Emily wonder whether this was yet another thing Darren had lied about. Where was the kindly woman she had hoped to see? Certainly not in this woman's haughty gaze of disapproval. It only served to make her even more worried that she was about to make a terrible mistake. "You'll do, I suppose," the old woman snapped with a dismissive sniff. "I trust that you will be an obedient wife and be devoted to my son and your future family. That is what my Darren deserves, a good wife." Her small eyes were still full of suspicion. Yes, I'm sure I will be, Emily stammered. Her head was dizzy with how many lies Darren had spun in his letters, but she feared Audrey wouldn't care if she pointed it out. It's all a little strange at the moment, but I hope we'll be friends. I missed my ma so much after she died. Audrey folded her arms across her thin chest. I don't need friends, Miss Garcia. I have my sons, and they are all I care about since my husband died. She leaned forward and peered closer at Emily. You seem healthy enough to work hard if a little undernourished. She started to turn away. I'm glad to see you don't have too much luggage. I can't abide a woman who fusses over her appearance. Emily felt deflated. This was hardly the warm welcome she had envisaged. And the ranch was so far from everywhere that she was already worrying about being isolated. Audrey might not need any friends, but she certainly did, or it would be a lonely existence. The sound of a horse approaching caught Emily's attention, and her heart sank as she saw a man riding up the long drive dressed in a somber black suit. Emily, don't just stand there, Darren called as he strolled back from the barn where he'd been talking to Ben. It's the preacher here to marry us. His jowly face brightened with anticipation, and he rubbed his hands together. Are you sure we shouldn't wait a little while to get to know each other better? Emily couldn't stay silent, and her heart raced as she desperately tried to think of a way to get out of it. Darren doesn't want to wait, and why should he? Walter lounged against the veranda rails, and his eyes gleamed with amusement as his gaze lingered on her shapely figure. You belong to us now, Miss Garcia. The sooner you learn that, the better. Isn't that right, Ma? Audrey nodded curtly. Of course, you're always right, Walter. She gave Emily a withering look. Why would you want to wait when you're marrying into one of the finest families in the district? You should count yourself lucky that Darren chose you. Emily still couldn't get her head around the fact that she would be married that very day. She had known it would be arranged quickly, but as Darren's mother lived at the ranch, she had hoped they would have been able to wait a little while to get to know each other first. Can I please go and change first? She asked tentatively, eager to buy some time so she could think. Darren shook his head. You look good enough. I arranged for the preacher to come especially, so let's not waste his time. But I have just arrived and the train was hot and cramped. I'd like to freshen up, she pleaded. I suppose so, Darren said with a begrudging sigh. Show her to the washroom, Ma, he scowled. Don't be long, though. Otherwise, the pastor will probably charge me more, and I don't see why I should pay a cent more than necessary. It's just a formality. Emily looked around the ranch interior as she followed the woman who would soon become her mother-in-law. She was impressed by the finely polished furniture and the expensive drapes and Persian rugs. It seemed strange that Darren was clearly wealthy, yet begrudged paying the preacher for his time. Perhaps he wasn't the charitable person he had portrayed himself to be. Another lie, she thought bitterly. Don't make a mess. Audrey's instructions were blunt as she ushered her into a rather grand room with a roll-top bath. Emily had never enjoyed the luxury of a room like it, and under different circumstances, it would have filled her with delight. Emily closed the door for some privacy and hastily splashed her face with cold water and tidied her hair. She had hoped it would clear her mind, but if anything, as the minutes ticked by, she found herself feeling even more panicked. What can I do? Is this really as bad as I think? She paced to the window and shivered as she watched the preacher dismounting from his horse. Darren couldn't possibly have lied about every single thing he told me, surely? Perhaps he's shy and will soon return to being the kind and considerate man he sounded like in his letters. She thought fleetingly about whether she would be able to climb through the window and run away while she still had the chance, then grimaced at her reflection in the mirror. I'm being silly. It's just tiredness from the journey. Her tumultuous thoughts were interrupted by an impatient knock on the bathroom door. What's taking you so long? Darren sounded angry, and he burst through the door without even asking if she was ready. Come on, the preacher doesn't have all day. His cheeks were even redder than they had been previously. Emily followed him out into the hallway. Darren, she took a deep breath and willed herself to speak out. Why were you not truthful with me in your letters? He looked visibly taken aback by her forthright question, as though he had never expected her to have the audacity to question him and his intentions. "It is no way to start a marriage," she added quietly as her confidence began to dwindle. His face darkened, and then he laughed humorlessly and gestured to the stairs. "If you don't like it here, get on your way, Emily." He leaned closer and gripped her shoulder, engulfing her in stale whiskey fumes. "But if you walk away, I will make sure everyone in this town and beyond knows that you stole from me by accepting the money for the train journey, only to go back on your word when you arrived." She gasped at his threat, and dread filled her heart as she realized there was nothing she could do. She was just as trapped as she had been with her pa. But here, if anything, it was worse. She knew nobody and was miles from the nearest town. As Audrey had said, the Hudsons were a well-respected family. Who would ever believe my side of things? Emily decided there was only one thing for it. She would have to make the best of her situation and pray the Lord would give her the strength to adapt, however hard it might be. She nodded graciously, determined not to show her fear at his cruel threat. "Very well, let's get married, Darren. I don't know what I was thinking, asking to wait." "Huh?" He was surprised by her change of tack. Emily swept ahead of him toward the parlor, enjoying a small moment of being in charge. "How lovely to celebrate your marriage today," the preacher said a moment later, giving her a kind smile. "I'm sure you must be excited about having a long and happy life together." He pulled out his Bible and cleared his throat, and for the next few minutes, Emily nodded woodenly and spoke only when prompted. And then it was all over. She was Darren Hudson's new wife. She belonged to him and Oak Ranch. Little did she know that her inner thoughts were almost the same as Ben's had been earlier, as she tried to reassure herself that she at least had a roof over her head and that there was still plenty to be thankful for. Perhaps things would not be so bad after all. Chapter 7. Emily finished sweeping the kitchen floor and put the brush away before going to stand at the kitchen window. Glancing around the kitchen, which felt larger than her entire apartment in 5 Points, she rolled her shoulders and sighed. There was a mound of wet sheets to hang over the range to dry and a bucket full of potatoes to peel. Not to mention, she still hadn't made a start on cooking dinner for the evening. Her muscles ached and her eyes felt gritty with exhaustion. She had never dreamed that being Darren's wife would be such hard work. It almost made her days at the bakery back east look pleasingly short. She had been at Crooked Hill for 2 weeks already, although it felt longer, and disillusionment had seeped into almost every part of her waking thoughts. Her lips curled in a rueful smile. She'd spent so many hours daydreaming about her new life when she lived in 5 Points, and now she was here. It was almost laughable how wrong she had gotten everything. She wasn't afraid of hard work, but Darren had assured her that she would have help keeping house on the ranch. In fact, she had been looking forward to befriending the other maids. However, a few days after she had become Mrs. Hudson, the family's cook had crept away in the middle of the night, leaving a note which Emily had opened and read before her husband had risen. She could remember the letter word for word. "Mr. Hudson, I am no longer able to continue in the position of cook in your employment at Oak Ranch. I have never worked somewhere so difficult, with such long hours and very little pay, and it is not something I will continue to tolerate. I know you have said previously that if I leave, you will spread rumors about me around the town to make sure I don't get work elsewhere. I would appreciate it if you did not do that, as I might be tempted to set the record straight with some truths about how you run your ranch. The Lord says that blackmail is wrong, and I happen to agree. Please do not try to find me. I am moving away from the area and will not set foot on your land again, Mrs. Fisher." Even now, some days later, Emily still felt a knot of fear in her chest as she thought about how scared she'd felt telling Darren about the letter and unexpected resignation. She had already discovered that Darren didn't like to be hurried in the morning. Once he'd finally woken up, Emily had brewed his favorite coffee and hovered nervously near the dining room table until he'd eaten a hearty breakfast before sliding the letter toward him. What made it worse was how she recognized the threats he had used on Mrs. Fisher. Clearly, Darren liked to get his own way, and didn't mind lying to achieve it. She would need to be careful because he had a nasty streak. She'd waited for his explosion of temper, but he had read the letter and thrown it aside, shrugging it off, which had surprised Emily. She wasn't that good anyway, and I have you now. It will be a good way to save some money, and you worked in a bakery, so it won't be any bother for you to take over her work. Emily was disappointed that he didn't say please, but told herself that at least it gave her a purpose. It would help her become part of the family, and perhaps if her meals impressed them all, she could ask for another cook to train alongside her once she was too busy raising children. But her happiness was short-lived. 2 days later, the housekeeper eloped to marry her sweetheart, who happened to be one of the ranch hands too, so they had lost 3 members of staff in as many days. Other than Darren's mother, Emily was the only woman on the ranch, so all the responsibilities of the cooking and the housekeeping had been automatically transferred to her without so much as a conversation to ask if she minded. Emily soon concluded that Darren didn't actually want a wife. He just wanted a servant at the family's beck and call in the house. And when she wondered why he'd lied about his age, the answer became apparent on their first outing to Crooked Hill. He wouldn't have settled for any woman. He wanted a young and attractive wife so he could show off with a pretty lady on his arm whenever the opportunity arose. A gust of wind outside rattled the windows and brought Emily back to the present, and she rubbed her eyes, trying to wake herself up. They were puffy from crying herself to sleep every night, and she felt sick to the stomach from berating herself for trusting his letters and being taken in by his deceit in such a way. Not only was she beholden to Darren now, but Walter and Audrey were also quick to place demands on her as well. I've swapped having to deal with Pa for having to honor and obey 3 taskmasters now. If only Audrey had a softer side. As a woman, she could have helped me settle in, but, as if summoned by her thoughts, Audrey suddenly appeared in the kitchen doorway, making Emily jump. The woman had a way of gliding through the house silently, as though she wanted to try and catch Emily out. It was most disconcerting. "Haven't you started cooking dinner yet?" Audrey wrinkled her nose at the sight of the unpeeled potatoes. "Darren can't eat late. It doesn't agree with his digestion." "Sorry. I was busy cleaning, and time has gotten away. I'll be sure to hurry." Emily felt cross that she sounded so feeble and decided she needed to stand up for herself more. "Actually, Audrey, I'm doing the work of 2 women now that the cook and housekeeper left." "What of it? You're young and fit, aren't you?" "Do you think Darren would consider getting another woman in to help? It's just I barely get a moment to myself." Audrey lifted the lid off a pan of stew and sampled it. "This needs more salt. Darren and Walter don't like bland food that tastes of nothing." She gave Emily a long stare. "We've discussed your work, and Darren told me you came from a rather humble background. We might look wealthy, but we're not going to throw away good money on staff when you can manage perfectly well. I only had 2 maids when I was first married, but times were different then." Emily wanted to point out that Audrey didn't lift a finger to help, but one glance at her mother-in-law's sour expression told her there was no point. Audrey ruled the roost, and she would have to fit in, or else. "Did you hear what I said about the salt?" Audrey continued. "And while we're at it, your cakes are too heavy. I used to make a wonderfully light sponge cake when I was your age." "I'm trying my best," Emily blurted out. "I worked in a bakery back home in New York City and cooked for my father every day, and I never had any complaints then." "If you were that good, it's a wonder you weren't snapped up as a wife back east, instead of needing to travel halfway across the country to find a man who would have you." Audrey raised one eyebrow and looked at her with disdain. "You have an unfeasibly high opinion of yourself, Emily, yet you leave a lot to be desired. My son deserves nothing but the best, and I expect you to work harder to give that to him. I intend to keep a close eye on you." Emily stifled a groan and wished she hadn't spoken back to the older woman. She already felt like she was being watched like a hawk, but now she'd just made her situation even worse than it was before. "Of course, Audrey. I shall do my best," she demurred. That evening, When she went to her bedroom and could finally close her door on the rest of the family, Emily knelt by her bed and prayed. Dear Lord, I think I've made a terrible mistake, and I can't see a way out of it. I'm grateful for the beautiful home and the plentiful food available to me. Thank you for all of the good fortune you have graced me with, and thank you for helping me to escape the life I used to live. But Lord, please help me again. I pray that you will lead me to the right path. This family offers me no respect or regard when in return I give them everything. I don't expect or want great wealth and riches. I just pray for the love and care of a kind-hearted man who will treat me with respect and dignity. Please, Lord, show me the way to a life of happiness. I place my trust in you to show me the way ahead. Amen. With her head still bowed, Emily blinked her tears away, feeling better. God would help her, she was sure. She just had to trust in him and do her best. She stood up to blow out her candle and felt a sense of warmth in her chest when she glanced through a gap in her drapes and caught a glimpse of Ben's silhouette against the open barn door. She rarely saw him to talk to, but at least he treated her kindly. She realized she did have one friend at Oak Ranch, and that gave her a small sense of hope for a better future. Chapter 8. Emily cracked 3 eggs into the large frying pan and watched them start to sizzle, letting her thoughts turn to Ben again, as they often did. His position at Oak Ranch puzzled her because he didn't seem to be a proper part of the family. She knew he was Darren and Walter's cousin, and Audrey was his aunt, but she had not yet seen him in the house. In fact, since she had arrived at the ranch, she had only seen him a few times, and he had been too busy working to stop and talk to her for long, although he had been perfectly polite and apologized for that. She concluded that he must live in the barn, or perhaps in the bunkhouse with the other ranch hands, which seemed odd to Emily when he was more than just another employee. Perhaps he prefers to be away from Darren and Walter. And who could blame him? Her lips lifted into a rueful smile. She wouldn't mind having more time away from them herself. What do you find so amusing? Audrey's sharp question as she came into the kitchen made Emily jump, and she hastily straightened her face into a more neutral expression. Anything to avoid the old woman's disapproval. I was just thinking about the farm cats. I saw them playing outside earlier when I went to collect the eggs, and they're so sweet. Audrey radiated suspicion. There's no time to stand around staring at the animals, Emily. Don't think I haven't noticed how often you're daydreaming instead of getting on with your chores. It was only a moment, but I'm sorry, it won't happen again. She slid the eggs onto a plate and cracked 3 more into the hot fat, which spattered onto her hands, making her wince. She would have liked to wash it off, but Audrey was standing between her and the sink with her arms crossed. Careless as well as lazy, Audrey muttered, shaking her head. Darren is waiting for his breakfast in the dining room. In the future, you're to have it ready earlier. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am. Emily checked herself. She wasn't a lowly employee anymore. I mean, yes, Audrey. Audrey strolled around the kitchen, lifting lids and checking everything was to her satisfaction. I've been watching you, and it seems you have far too much time on your hands, and we all know what the Bible says about idle hands. Emily felt a pang of resentment at the untruth. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. She barely had time to sit at all during the day, but Audrey wouldn't care. You need a few extra chores to keep you busy, Audrey exclaimed. The library is looking dusty and uncared for, which is unacceptable. After breakfast, you must scrub and wax the entire floor and dust all the books. I will check later that it has been done to the standard we expect in this house. The whole library? Emily bristled. But Audrey, what about all the cooking for lunch and dinner as well? I don't know how I will be able to fit it all in. As I said, you'll get more done if you stop daydreaming. Are you saying you can't manage your own home? What sort of wife would admit such a thing? Audrey's voice was low, but contempt burned in her brown eyes. Emily knew she had made yet another mistake by trying to reason with the woman. But the library was the grandest room she had ever seen, with every wall lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. All for show, because Darren rarely read, she'd noticed. It would be impossible to dust them all in one day around the other things she needed to do. I'll do my best, she said wearily. Audrey gave her a humorless smile, looking triumphant. If you choose not to complete your duties as Darren's wife, then he will have no choice but to cast you aside and find a better woman for the role. One who can look after the home and her husband in the way that he deserves. She seemed determined to make Emily's life a misery and to see her fail. Emily watched her retreating back and hastily pulled the bacon and fried potatoes from the range and put them onto a tray. Her heart raced as she tried to figure out how she would get the library completed on time. She would have to work faster than ever. But the thought of Audrey's threat becoming a reality sent shivers down her spine, as that would leave her in a terrible situation. A divorced woman far away from home would not fare well in these parts, with her reputation undoubtedly ruined by the Hudson family's slanders about her, which they would delight in spreading in Crooked Hill and beyond. She could barely swallow her food when she joined the rest of the family for breakfast in the dining room. As Audrey, Darren, and Walter gossiped about local matters without bothering to include her, Emily picked miserably at her potatoes and eggs. The one relief about her marriage was that Darren barely seemed to have any interest in her beyond her being responsible for the home. He had even given her a separate bedroom, and he had never visited it. As confusing as it was to be in such a loveless marriage, she didn't think she could bear to have Darren's attention after dark, when he was so uninterested in her any other time. But Walter was entirely different, and she glanced at him warily as she quickly cleared the plates away to run and fetch some toast and more coffee from the kitchen. His lecherous gaze struck fear into her heart each time she caught him staring at her hungrily, and she had been very careful not to be left alone with him at any time. It was a wonder that Darren and Audrey hadn't noticed, but Walter was sly, which made it even worse. Emily was not so naive as to think that all men behaved in a gentlemanly way, but there was a certain arrogance about Walter. She suspected he treated women like objects to be conquered and owned. She'd overheard several of the ranch hands whispering about children he had fathered in the district, with no intention of doing right by the women he sullied. As she picked up his plate, she felt his large hand stroke her leg while Darren and Audrey discussed the day ahead. He smirked at her with a cruel glint in his eye, knowing that she could hardly complain when his family thought so little of her. No, Emily did not trust Walter at all, and as she hurried back to the kitchen, she vowed to stay away from him. He was a nasty piece of work. Emily hummed her favorite hymns as she polished and buffed the bookshelves a few hours later in an attempt to raise her spirits. She had already run a damp cloth over the books, and she could tell by the amount of dust on them that her suspicions were right. The books were for show rather than reading. She wondered whether anyone would notice if she took a couple of them to her bedroom to read by candlelight at night. It would be nice to escape into some stories and forget her worries. Suddenly, the library door creaked open, and Emily's blood ran cold as she saw Walter slip into the room. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it with his arms folded, watching her intently without saying a word. "Can I help you with anything, Walter?" She spoke to him as nicely as she could manage, even though her mouth had gone dry. There was no other way out of the room, and she was trapped. She doubted anyone would hear her call out either. "You have a wonderful collection of books," she added, desperately hoping her small talk would bore him and he would leave. "I'm not here for the books, woman." He gave her a wolfish smile. "Carry on. Don't mind me." The atmosphere crackled with tension, and Emily came to a decision. She would rather be shouted at by Audrey for failing in her chores than be trapped with Walter for one more minute. She left the duster and polish on the shelf and hurried to the door, hoping to squeeze past him. "Excuse me, please," she said, as calmly as she could. "I just remembered I need to get back to the kitchen now to start preparing lunch." To her relief, he stood aside to allow her access to the door. But just as she reached for the handle, he grabbed her arm and looked at her with a greedy expression. "It's not just our ma keeping an eye on you, Emily." He licked his lips and tightened his grip, not caring that it hurt. "I am watching you too, and I like what I see." His eyes were dark with desire. "Oak Ranch is a long way from Crooked Hill, So if you have thoughts of leaving, you should know that you would never make it alone. I have no intention of leaving, she stammered. I'm happily married to Darren, your brother. She lifted her chin defiantly. He needed to be reminded of the facts. Surely Darren would not tolerate this behavior from Walter, but her words seemed to make him more determined. He yanked her closer and placed his other hand on her waist. You are a pretty young thing. Darren's too old and staid, but I sure would like to show you how a real man behaves with a woman like you. Emily's fear was suddenly replaced with anger at how she had been duped into coming to this awful place to be treated like the lowest sort of maid, and at how Walter thought he could take what he wanted, and she would have to go along with it. Before she had time to even think about her actions, she lifted her leg and kicked him as hard as she could in his shin. He stumbled backward from both the pain and the shock and tried to rub the pain away. You're not a real man, Walter, she cried. If you were a gentleman, you'd know no woman in their right mind would want you groping them like this. Why, you little... He straightened up again, and his eyes glittered darkly with outrage. She didn't wait to hear the rest. Do that again, and I'll tell Darren and anyone who will listen. She wrenched the door open and ran back to the kitchen as fast as she could, cowering in the pantry as she strained to hear whether he had followed. As her hammering heart gradually returned to normal, Emily wished she could be anywhere other than Oak Ranch at that very moment. How can I get out of this situation, Lord? She whispered over and over again. All she wanted was a happy marriage and to raise a family. But she was stuck at the ranch where she knew no one, with a lecherous brother-in-law, a husband who treated her like a slave, and a mother-in-law who despised her. She was starting to think that perhaps running away would be a better option. But where would she go? Chapter 9. Emily gasped with unexpected delight as she threw open the outside door of the kitchen one morning in mid-November. Overnight, thick snow had fallen, blanketing the ranch and land beyond it as far as the eye could see in soft, white snowdrifts. She had been so busy with her early morning chores that she hadn't even had a chance to look outside, but now the crisp winter air filled her lungs, and she blinked as the winter sun made everything sparkle. What beauty the Lord has given us today. Across the barnyard, she could hear the cheerful chatter of the ranch hands as they fed and watered the animals, which were all brought near the homestead for the long winter months. She longed to run across and join in, but didn't dare risk it. Emily had never experienced snowfall like it before, and she enjoyed the magical feel and otherworldly feeling it lent to the familiar landscape, which now looked so different. The snow she'd grown up with in 5 Points had always quickly turned to dirty gray slush on the ground where people walked and wagons rumbled past. But this was simply magical. By the time she sat down to lunch in the dining room, Emily was desperate to share her delight and craved some conversation. The ranch looks so pretty, with all this snow and such a bright blue sky above it. I honestly have never seen anything like this before. It's a wonderful blessing, don't you agree? She smiled tentatively at the Hudsons, praying that just for once they would treat her as an equal. Darren was ladling chicken soup into his mouth, and he stopped mid-spoonful, giving her a surprised look. A blessing? That shows how little you know about life out west, he harumphed. Snow like this makes everything hard work. His face darkened, and he thumped the table, clattering the cutlery. The ranch hands use it as an excuse to get less work done. Oh, the snow looks so pretty. Walter mimicked her by trying to speak in a high voice, then sniggered as Darren looked even angrier. Tears pricked the back of Emily's eyes, as seemed to happen so often these days, and she lowered her gaze. This wretched winter will be the death of me. And it's only just started, Darren grumbled. I can't even get to the saloon in Crooked Hill when the snow's this deep. If you took a bit more time to educate yourself, Emily, you would know that times are hard for us at the moment. He glared around the table and received a nod of agreement from his brother. I'll tell you something else, Walter piped up. The ranch hands are getting idle. They think they can just sit back during this weather and that we won't even notice. He gulped a generous mouthful of claret and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. The last lot of cattle that were sold didn't make anywhere near as much money as the ones before that, so something's not going right. His anger was clear to see on his face as he took another swig of drink. I agree. They're becoming complacent, Darren replied gruffly. It's not on. I should withhold some pay to punish them. Do they think we don't notice standards are slipping? Emily's mouth gaped open in surprise, but she quickly closed it again. She had a clear view of the barns and corrals from the kitchen, and even with her limited knowledge of ranching, she had observed that Ben and the others seemed to work harder than any men she'd known. They rose long before dawn, and the only time they weren't working was when they were asleep at night or for their weekly visit to church. Even in the evenings, when it was too dark to work outside, they mended tools or cleaned the leather harnesses in the barn. I blame Ben, Walter said harshly. He gave Emily a hard stare as if daring her to challenge him. She wondered if he was jealous of Ben with his strong, manly good looks and cheerful, hard-working demeanor. She wouldn't put it past Walter to resent the fact that Ben was friendly with her on the odd times their paths crossed. He's meant to be in charge of the ranch hands, so if the work is getting shoddy, perhaps Ben should go. No, not Ben, please. Emily's heart sank, but she couldn't let on how much the idea horrified her. Otherwise, Walter would probably banish him just out of spite to upset her even more. Ben was the only person who had shown her any kindness at the ranch, and although they hadn't spoken much since her arrival, she knew it would be a much worse place to be without the security of knowing he was across the yard. She wanted to leap to her feet and tell them Ben was the last person to blame. He worked hard and cared for the animals far more than Darren and Walter realized. If anything, they didn't deserve Ben, not the other way around. The words hovered on the tip of her tongue, but she bit them back. When Darren and Walter were in this sort of mood, it would be worse off for Ben and her if she uttered a word of what was on her mind. Audrey took a dainty sip of water and smiled indulgently at Darren. You're right, my dear. They think they can get away with all sorts. I'm worried that some of the men are getting restless, although goodness knows why. This is the best place to work in the district. Restless? What do you mean, Ma? Darren's bleary eyes looked confused. I have a feeling a couple of them are considering heading elsewhere, or perhaps into Crooked Hill to find work there instead, so they have more saloons and female company, especially if they think we'll be cut off with the snow. She sighed, and her brow furrowed. Labor is hard to come by. We'll never be able to replace them. Walter and Darren both looked alarmed. If they were short-handed, they might have to put in a hard day's work. It was a shocking thought for the lazy brothers. Audrey looked at Emily with a thoughtful expression on her face. What the ranch hands need is a good hot meal once a day to fill their bellies and warm them up. It would make them work harder, and they would be happier and more productive. That's a wonderful idea, Ma. Darren looked mightily relieved. Emily, add that to your list of chores immediately. We can't afford to lose any workers at the moment. It's even harder to look after the cattle and horses in this weather, and we must keep profits up. Walter's eyes narrowed with barely concealed annoyance, and he sloshed some more wine into his glass. She suspected that he had been trying to find a way to get rid of his cousin. I'd be more than happy to help out, Emily agreed enthusiastically. Walter scowled even more, and she almost laughed. She knew that with Darren's demand for her to provide the ranch hands with a hot meal every day, there would be less chance of Walter engineering ways to corner her. He was a sore loser, she thought. You are? Good. Audrey was slightly taken aback and shot her a puzzled look. Clearly, she had thought Emily would resist. But what Audrey didn't know was that Emily's new strategy to survive her time at Oak Ranch was to keep busy. But most of all, she was thrilled to finally have a legitimate reason to get out of the house when she took the food over to the barns where the ranch hands ate. It would give her an opportunity to spend at least a little bit of time with Ben, in some friendly company. Now that the mood had lightened, Emily took a deep breath and dared to speak again, hoping they would be more likely to talk to and tolerate her as she had just accepted more work. What do you do to celebrate Christmas? Darren, a decorated tree, I'm sure. especially as your house is so large?" she asked tentatively. It was immediately met with a hollow laugh from her husband. "A decorated tree?" he chuckled. "Such celebrations are a waste of money and a waste of time. Our father never believed in celebrating Christmas, and as he died at that time of the year, we feel even less inclined to allow such ridiculous goings-on now." Walter and Audrey nodded their agreement without even raising their eyes from their plates. "Oh, that's such a shame," Emily blurted out. "I loved Christmas when I was younger, and I was hoping it would be wonderful here, with the snow surrounding us. My ma passed away on Christmas Eve as well, but she would still have wanted me to find happiness at such a special time of the year." She had been clinging to some sort of dream that the festive season might mellow Darren and his family and make everything better, and disappointment settled over her. "Maybe it's time to start some new traditions," she mumbled quietly, hardly daring to meet Darren's eyes. Audrey scrunched up her napkin and dropped it on the table, glaring at her. "It would be wise for you to remember your place, girl. I am the matriarch of this family, not you. We will most certainly not be entertaining any ideas of gaudy Christmas trees. Whatever next? You'd better step in line and respect our decisions." The rest of the meal was eaten in silence, and Emily pushed her dreams of cozy, festive celebrations to the back of her mind. Chapter 10. The following day, Emily added a pinch of salt and a twist of pepper to the hearty stew and gave it one final stir, nodding with satisfaction. She had cooked it long and slow for hours on the range, which suited the tougher cut of meat perfectly. Darren only liked the best meat and had told her in no uncertain terms that she was to cook economical dishes for the ranch hands, as that was all they deserved. She had already prepared cornbread, which was nestled under a cloth in her basket to keep warm, and she grabbed an oven cloth to lift the pan of stew and nudged the door open with her foot. The cold air made her catch her breath as she ventured outside, and her breath clouded around her head. The temperature had plummeted, and she picked her way cautiously across the barnyard, doing her best to stick to the freshly fallen snow, which was less icy. "Dinner's ready?" she called. She was surprised that the bunkhouse was still empty and figured the men were still out working in the fading evening light. It was a Spartan room with narrow bunks for the men to sleep in, a couple of threadbare armchairs, and a blackened stove at one end. She put the pan on the stove to keep warm until they returned, then added a couple of pieces of wood and stoked the flames. The warmth made her cheeks glow, and she wondered about sewing them some patchwork throws to make the place feel more cozy. "Sorry, ma'am, I didn't see you come in." The young ranch hand coughed awkwardly as he strode in, taking his hat off, and looked startled to see her there. He grinned when he spotted the pan and sniffed appreciatively. "This is your evening meal," she explained to him. Mr. Hudson has decided I'm to bring something out for you all every night from now on. It might not be fancy food, but I'll make sure it's hearty and filling. Tonight, it's stew and cornbread. Do you have enough bowls, or shall I run and fetch some more?" "Why, thank you, ma'am. That's mighty kind of you, and we have plenty of bowls." The young man rubbed his hands together and grinned, gesturing to a stack of tin bowls stored neatly on a nearby shelf that she hadn't noticed. "I sure was getting fed up of Tyler's beans and bacon every night, and there was never quite enough to go around. You're most welcome. I'll collect the pans in the morning to wash. Have a pleasant evening." Emily made her way to the door, disappointed that she had not seen Ben, but as she went to leave, the young man interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am, Ben doesn't stay over here in the bunkhouse. He has a setup in the hayloft in the barn. He prefers to be able to keep a close eye on the animals. Should I take him some over?" Her spirits lifted, and she bustled back to grab a bowl and ladled a generous portion of stew into it. "No, that's okay. I'll take him this on my way back." She broke off a hunk of cornbread and put it all in her basket before taking her leave. Her heart fluttered with anticipation as she headed across to the big barn, which was set a little way away from the bunkhouse. The large wooden door was ajar, and soft light spilled out onto the snow from the oil lamps. She wasn't sure why she suddenly felt nervous until she realized it was because she was entering Ben's domain now, and she didn't want to make any mistakes. His good opinion of her mattered. She hovered outside for a few seconds and then entered cautiously, mindful of not frightening the cattle or horses. The first thing she was aware of was the scent of sweet meadow hay and a row of brown eyes gazing placidly at her as 3 cows lifted their heads to stare. She was just about to call out to announce herself when the sound of soft talking reached her. "There now, that's better, isn't it? Your leg might be a bit sore for a few days, but that abscess in your hoof is all better now. A couple of days stable rest, and you'll be back to your old mischievous self." Ben was rhythmically stroking the horse's neck in the stall at the end of the barn. His voice sounded so gentle and kind that it made Emily's heart swell with emotion. She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard such kindness. She gave a polite cough, and Ben grinned as he realized he had company. "Emily, this is a nice surprise. I don't get many visitors to the barn from the big house. How are you doing?" Emily started to reply, but instead of a cheery greeting, to her horror, emotion clogged her throat, and her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what's gotten into me," she croaked. It felt like a dam breaking as his kindness made her acutely aware of just how unhappy she was with Darren. "I'm sorry," she said, gulping and giving him a shaky smile. "I brought a hot meal for you, and a crying woman is probably the last thing you want to see." Ben murmured one last word to the horse and shut the stable door behind him before striding to her side. "It smells good, but the food can wait." He took the basket from her hands, placed it on the ground, and then steered her to a hay-covered bench so she could sit down. As the tears rolled down her rosy cheeks, Emily waited for embarrassment to engulf her, but it didn't, and that was because she trusted Ben. "What is it? What's troubling you?" His eyes searched hers for a response. "It's nothing really. I'm just being silly." She shook her head, knowing that if she started to talk about Darren, she might risk being disloyal to the family. But Ben was not so easily convinced, and his eyebrows lifted. "I just heard how kindly you were talking to the animals, and it made me emotional." "I don't know why," she added honestly. His frown grew deeper as he considered her response. "How is Darren treating you, Miss Garcia? I mean, Mrs. Hudson?" Emily shuddered and twisted the edge of her apron. Please, call me Emily, Ben. I can't bear to be called Mrs. Hudson. That is Audrey's title, after all. I don't think I'll ever get used to it." "I'm sorry." His blue eyes clouded with worry. "Do you feel you can tell me what's wrong, Emily?" She took a deep breath. Instinctively, she knew she could trust Ben, but it would be like opening Pandora's box. Once she confided in him, there could be no going back. "It's nothing. I expect I'm just tired because the family expects me to do everything since the cook and the housekeeper left." She tried to make light of her miserable situation and gave a small shrug. "At least it keeps me busy and makes the days go faster." He shook his head. "It's not right. You deserve to be treated better than that." Ben plucked a piece of straw off the floor and turned it between his fingers before throwing it away again. "And Walter? How is he behaving toward you?" He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, and she noticed a muscle twitch in his jaw. "Does Ben know what Walter did in the library? What he's like toward me?" She suddenly feared she had misjudged the situation. The only way he could know was if Walter had told him, and that must mean they were closer than she thought. "It's okay. You can talk to me," he reassured her calmly and quietly. "I know what he's like." She saw the muscle in his jaw twitch again as he clenched his teeth, bracing himself for her answer, and it reassured her that Ben would not condone Walter's behavior. "I try hard to make sure I am never alone with him," she said bluntly, feeling the blood rush to her cheeks at what had been left unsaid. Ben shook his head and clenched his fists. "I dread to think how hard it must be for you over in the big house. Walter has no respect and doesn't care about other people's feelings at all. I have seen how he is with his own horse, and it tears me apart that I must let him take the mare out whenever he wants. You can tell a lot about a man by the way he treats animals," he muttered. "I know. He's thoughtless. At least Darren mostly ignores me." Ben turned slightly on the bench and rested his hand over Emily's. Her breath caught in her throat at his touch, and she wondered fleetingly why he had this strange effect on her. "Please promise me you'll be careful." His gaze was urgent, and she nodded, but then hastily moved her hands to break their contact. She wanted nothing more than to be held by him. In fact, she wondered if she might be falling in love with him, but she was a married woman. She looked away so her face would not betray her. "I will be careful. Thank you, Ben." Her heart skipped a beat as she twisted to meet his eyes again. "I can't have feelings for him. We can only be friends, that's all. I feel safer knowing I have you to turn to if anything else happens," she said softly. With a nod of agreement, Ben tactfully changed the subject, and she followed his lead. "The stew smells good. I'll be bringing a meal over every evening from now on." Her heart lifted in spite of what she'd just told herself. It would be good to see Ben each day. "I was surprised to find out that the Hudsons don't celebrate Christmas much," she added. "Christmas?" He tilted his head slightly, confused by this sudden change of conversation. "Yes, they said they do not celebrate. I had hoped that I would finally have another nice Christmas like I enjoyed when I was a child before my ma died," she said wistfully. "I dream that one day I will sing carols by the tree with my family. The fire will be crackling in the hearth, and we'll have a nice meal to celebrate." She bit her lip as it hit her that she would never have a Christmas like that with Darren. "Did your pa not like to celebrate Christmas after your mother died?" He sounded concerned again, and Emily glanced away. "No, he preferred to be stone-cold drunk after that time." She shrugged, although the memory still hurt. "He changed. I like to remember what he was like when I was younger, when things were different. Well, if it's any consolation, I usually just spend my Christmas with the animals in the barn. They don't let me down, I find." He smiled as he made his little joke, and she smiled in return. "I like to mark the season by sneaking the animals a little bit more food than they normally have. But don't tell Darren," he added with a wink of his blue eye. And she laughed. "Don't you feel lonely? I thought the family would invite you over to the house?" "No, not really. I have never had any desire to spend any time in the house with my cousins and aunt. I prefer my own company and that of the animals. I make wreaths from the holly and the ivy in the woods, and I put them up in places around the ranch to mark the occasion at least as much as I can." His eyes lit up, and she knew then that he loved the festive time as much as she did. "I think our dreams are similar, Emily. I hope one day to spend Christmas with a family of my own and make it really special." Their eyes met, and they shared a smile, and suddenly Emily knew for sure that she felt something more than friendship toward Ben. "Emily, what are you doing loitering over in the barns?" Audrey's strident shout shattered the tender moment, and Emily gasped with fright and jumped up. I must go, or she'll be furious. I still have more chores to do." She rushed to the door, feeling guilty. "What am I thinking? I'm married to Darren. There can never be anything between Ben and me." "I'm coming now, Audrey," she replied. "Thank you for the meal," Ben called after her. "I look forward to seeing you tomorrow." His smile made her falter, and a surge of happiness flooded through her again before she slipped out into the darkening night and hurried back to the homestead. She didn't want to do anything to give Audrey an excuse to stop this small pleasure she now had in her life, that was for sure. Chapter 11. By early December, it still hadn't stopped snowing, and Emily was starting to understand why it was more problematic than it was pretty. The snow was so deep that the ranch was virtually cut off from anything beyond its boundary, other than on horseback. Her daydreams of visiting Crooked Hill in the buckboard wagon would likely not happen until spring now, so every day was filled with chores instead, morning, noon, and night. Even during the worst winters in 5 Points, it had still been possible to walk to most places, but on Oak Ranch, she felt a strange sense of isolation and claustrophobia. The beauty of the landscape still delighted her daily, but scarcely a day went by without Audrey criticizing her. Whether it was a job not done to her satisfaction or not being quick enough, there was always something wrong. Try not to take it personally, Ben had said a few evenings earlier after Audrey's stinging contempt was shouted across the barnyard for all to hear. Emily had swept the snow off the veranda, but in the time it had taken her to cook dinner, fresh snow had fallen, and Audrey was cross that she might slip, even though she never ventured outside. "I think she would have liked Darren to marry someone different," Emily had murmured. "Nobody would have measured up to be good enough for her oldest son." Ben shot back, giving her a sympathetic smile. Emily had almost gotten to the point where she could ignore the criticism now. Even if she worked around the clock or tried to anticipate the Hudsons' every need, they still would have found fault with something. "It's just the way it is," she concluded. But every night, as she went to bed, she gave thanks to God for Ben's steady presence. Just knowing he was nearby made life more bearable. And she forgave herself for the blossoming feelings she had for him and the pleasure she took from their conversations. Darren would never need to know, and she and Ben would never be more than friends. She reasoned that if Ben's company provided a few minutes of lightness and humanity in her day, it could only be because the Lord intended it. It was wash day, and steam billowed up from the copper tub that Emily was stirring the men's shirts in. It was tiring, laborious work. But she liked the sense of satisfaction after they had been through the mangle to wring out the water and were draped on the clothes rack over the stove, and the scent of lavender soap wafted through the kitchen. Her shoulders ached from carrying buckets of water to keep the tub filled, but it gave her a chance to let her thoughts wander as she pondered a troubling development with Darren. She had tried to ignore it, but couldn't any longer. The closer it was getting to Christmas, the more Darren was drinking. At first, Emily wondered if it was because of the bad weather that made him worry about their livestock. But Ben assured her that things were not that bad. It could only be because it was approaching the anniversary of Mr. Hudson Sr.'s death. In a normal marriage, she could have broached the subject and offered comfort, but this was no normal marriage. She wasn't brave enough to ask Darren, and she knew he would not talk to her about it anyway. Besides, she had learned that limiting her conversations with any of the Hudsons seemed to be the safest thing to do. If she could have clicked her fingers and become invisible to them, she might have considered it, she mused with a wry smile as she stirred the shirts with a wooden paddle. Each morning, Darren looked more and more bleary-eyed. He and Walter never went out onto the ranch, but preferred to shout their instructions for the men from the veranda before retreating hastily back to the warmth of the fireside. It had become normal now for Darren to uncork a new bottle of claret to go with his lunch, and in the evenings he kept his glass of whiskey topped up until he stumbled to bed. She felt sad to realize that her husband was exactly like her father in relation to drinking. She had thought heading west would provide her escape, but now she felt as trapped again as a fly in a spider's web. With the drink, Darren was becoming more volatile and increasingly thoughtless with his comments about her. There was no pretense that he felt anything pleasant for her. She was only there to serve him as a glorified maid. Her thoughts turned toward Walter, and she shuddered, automatically looking toward the shadowy hallway beyond the washroom to check that he wasn't lurking, waiting to pounce on her. With an armful of wet washing, she wouldn't be able to fend him off, which was exactly what he liked. Walter was getting bolder, and being on guard against him was exhausting. A number of times, he had pulled her into an embrace and tried to kiss her. So far, she had managed to twist free and push him away, but it was only a matter of time until his desire would overtake him. She grimaced at the thought of it. There was not one single thing she liked about Walter Hudson, especially how sly he was. He pretended to be interested in her, but she knew his heart was as hard as granite. Ben's warning words rang in her ears, and she made sure never to give Walter a minute of her time or attention. Her stomach churned as she recalled a close shave several days earlier. Walter had cornered her in a dark corner of Darren's study. "My brother isn't man enough for a woman like you," he'd sneered. "If you were my wife, I'd never let you out of my sight." He had gripped her shoulder and whispered what he would do during the long winter nights. Emily had felt bile rising in her throat, and it was only Darren's stumbling into the room at that moment that had stopped her screaming for help. She pushed a lock of hair out of her eyes and gave herself a mental shake. I have to stop dwelling on Walter's awful behavior. As soon as the weather allows for it, he'll be off into town in the evenings, flirting with women there. and I won't need to worry about him. Glancing out of the window, she saw that the sun had come out, and it looked like a gloriously crisp winter's day. She quickly hung up the last 2 shirts over the range and grabbed her basket. She needed to fetch the dirty plates from the bunkhouse and scatter corn for the chickens in their coop. It would give her a chance to escape from the oppressive atmosphere in the house and enjoy some fresh air. 10 minutes later, Emily slipped into the big barn, where she knew Ben always was at this time of the day, forking hay into the feeding racks for the horses. "Howdy!" He grinned and gestured toward the bench where they liked to sit and chat for a few minutes when there was time. "I put a blanket there to keep your dress clean." She put her basket aside and picked up the spare pitchfork instead. "How about I give you a hand instead?" Her spirits lifted as they worked in companionable silence for a few minutes. The steady bending and flicking motion warmed her up, and soon Emily needed to loosen her shawl and fan her cheeks. "I probably look a mess, but it's nice to help." Ben shook his head and absent-mindedly reached out to remove a tuft of hay that had gotten caught in her hair. His hand lingered for a moment on her shoulder, and his expression was hard to read because he was silhouetted against the winter sun streaming through the door behind him. "You could never look a mess," he said softly. "Seeing you is the best part of my day, and seeing you is all that keeps me going," Emily blurted out. She blushed, and Ben took the pitchfork off her and turned to put them away. "Do you have time to sit a while?" he asked casually. She nodded without hesitation. Even if Audrey was looking for her, she didn't want to miss the chance of 10 minutes with Ben. "I understand now that the snow is inconvenient, but it is just so beautiful out there," she said to Ben, not for the first time, as he was the only one she could share it with. "I never imagined that the western frontier landscape could look so beautiful," she sighed wistfully. "I think this will be my favorite time of the year here, even if no one else seems to like it." "I couldn't agree more. There's something magical about the sun sparkling on the snow." He ran a hand through his tousled hair and gave her a look of amusement. "You know what? It's not as bad for the animals as my cousins would have you believe. Sure, it's more work for us ranch hands, but we don't mind if it keeps the cattle healthy." "Oh, Darren's always grumbling about how hard things are. The problem Darren and Walter have with the winter weather is that it costs them more. The animals need more fodder, although we had a good crop of hay this year, and we can't move cattle away to sell them. Most other ranchers take this into account. It's just part of the cycle of the seasons. But those two aren't very in tune with nature." Emily listened with fascination, enjoying his obvious enthusiasm. "How do you know so much about ranching?" she asked. "You said you haven't always been here." She had come to realize that Ben was a private person who didn't talk about himself much, unlike her husband, who bragged about his achievements constantly, even though most of them were because of Ben's hard work. "My parents had a small ranch, so I have always lived on the land around cattle and horses." He stretched his long legs out and crossed his booted feet. "I loved being outside with Pa, although I'm sure I got in the way more than I helped." He smiled at the memory. "Pa encouraged me to go with him, and I learned everything I know from him. He was a good stockman, and it's what I use all these years later to help run this ranch." "So, how exactly are you related? You seem so different to them all." She hoped he would take that in the positive way that she meant it. Ben chuckled. "Thank you. I'm glad to hear it. My father was Aunt Audrey's brother, but they were both very different people. You would never have guessed they were related. Pa wanted the best for his animals, and Ma supported him. They were very much in love. Audrey always wanted Oak Ranch to be the biggest and best in the district, no matter what it took." His expression clouded briefly, and Emily hoped she hadn't upset him by asking about the past. Pa didn't agree with how they farmed here, but he kept his opinions to himself rather than upset his sister. "How long have you been on this ranch?" she asked carefully. "It's almost 13 years now." Ben shook his head slightly, as though it was hard to believe, but he didn't look sad. "My parents died unexpectedly when I was 12, when a bridge collapsed during a storm. Their wagon was swept away in the river, and I never saw them again. Aunt Audrey very kindly offered to take me in, and I will always be grateful that I wasn't left alone. They put me straight to work, and I haven't stopped since the day I arrived. It must have been hard. She felt a wave of sympathy for him, but also admiration. Ben had made the best of a bad situation. It highlighted the stark difference between his attitude and determination, compared to Darren and Walter's sense of entitlement. Darren and Walter always seemed to resent me, though, he stated plainly, without rancor. They were a lot older than me, both still single and living with their parents, and they didn't want a 12-year-old child taking all the attention. I quickly figured out it was better for me to stay out of the way, so I buried myself in work and chose to sleep in the hayloft over here. He grinned. I told them it meant I could look after the livestock better because I was ready to work at any moment, and they seemed happy enough about it. I can see the allure of that, Emily replied, matching his grin. But don't you miss being in a proper home, especially at this time of year? She paused and then asked the question she most wondered about. Why do you stay, Ben? You're so skilled. Wouldn't you rather have a place of your own? Ben glanced around at the familiar sight of contented animals in their stalls and beyond, to where two of the young ranch hands were shoveling snow and chopping wood across the barnyard. I don't think Walter and Darren would know how to care for their animals. Also, I'm not sure the other ranch hands would put up with their bad-tempered demands if I wasn't here to act as the go-between. Some of them are already considering leaving come spring. I'm worried that if I left, the animals might suffer. It weighs heavily on my mind. They deserve to be cared for right, he explained quietly. Emily's heart went out to him. It proved he was a good man. And you deserve to have a good life, she said gently. I learned the hard way with my situation that we can't be indebted to people forever, even if they were once kind to us. Things change. Ben pulled a rueful face. You speak a lot of sense, but Pa always believed we should stick by family. They don't treat you well, Emily said, defending him. They certainly treat me differently from the other workers, he said regretfully. Because I am family, they pay me a pittance. It would take me years to save up enough to buy some land. What is your real dream? She leaned forward and nodded encouragingly. If you could make a Christmas wish? Ben's eyes lit up. Well, now you're asking. My dream is to have a small ranch of my own. Nothing fancy like this, just a functional ranch where the animals are well cared for and are happy and bring in enough money to keep my family. His smile faltered a moment later, and he shrugged. It's a nice thought, and I've racked my brain on how to make it happen, but don't give up hope, she cried, clasping her hands together with passion. And I mustn't give up hope either. I'm sorry for how your family treats you. You are the kindest man I have ever met, and you deserve so much more than this. Let's trust in God that one day our luck will turn, and we will have the kind of life that we dream of. In the warmth of the barn, they looked longingly into each other's eyes, neither voicing their true feelings, which were stirring for both of them. Perhaps one day, God might bring Ben and me together with a small ranch like he described. The thought of a brighter future filled Emily's heart, even as she jumped up to leave, mindful that she had probably stayed for too long. Back at the house, Emily was soon hard at work again, scrubbing the kitchen floor, while a large joint of ham studded with cloves roasted in the range. With each sweep of the brush and soapy water, her head filled with daydreams about how different her life could have been, and perhaps how it could be in the future if she prayed for a second chance. If only she had refused to marry Darren on the first day that she had arrived, she could have gotten to know him and would have been more careful with her decision. If only it had been Ben who had placed the advertisement in the Matrimonial Times instead of his cousin. But what use is it, thinking about what-ifs, she told herself with a grimace, scrubbing even harder. Bring more claret, Darren mumbled when she served the roast dinner later that evening. His vest was stained where he had spilt his soup, and his words sounded muffled and slurred. Do you think that maybe you've had enough already? Emily asked in a low voice. She darted a look at Audrey, hoping she would back her up. It's not good for you. Don't tell me what to do in my own home, Darren roared. You're here to keep house, not make my life a misery with your mean-spirited comments. Audrey tutted loudly at her suggestion. My son is clearly not happy in his marriage, or he wouldn't need to turn to drink. Emily almost laughed at her absurd comment. Didn't Audrey realize that Darren had been indulging in too much drink long before she had arrived at Oak Ranch? She glanced at Walter to see his reaction, but he just smirked and gave her a long look that made her blood run cold. I'll fetch the claret now, she murmured, standing up and hurrying away. If Darren couldn't see it was making him ill, and his family didn't seem to care, what more could she do? By the end of the meal, Darren had gotten to the stage where everything offended him. That scoundrel Fletcher owes me money, he grumbled, speaking about one of their neighbors, and Ben should know better than to give the cattle so much hay. We're not wealthy, no matter what he thinks. Folks are trying to take advantage of you, left and right, Walter drawled. Emily gave him a sharp look. Was Walter deliberately stirring up trouble? I won't put up with it, Darren growled. He stood up abruptly and stumbled out of the dining room, pausing only to demand that Emily should bring him more claret. As the evening stretched on, the house fell quiet. Once she had cleaned up from dinner, Emily heaved a weary sigh and decided she would take herself off to her bedroom. It was her only sanctuary in the house, and she was thankful for the little space she could call her own. Her heart sank when she spotted Walter loitering in the hallway outside her room, but she lifted her chin defiantly, buoyed up by Ben's kind words earlier in the day. I've finished my chores for the day. Whatever you want will have to wait until tomorrow, Walter. You reckon? He drawled. His eyes were unfocused, and she realized he must have had plenty of claret as well. Maybe I'm tired of waiting, Emily, he laughed cruelly. Soon, my brother will be so far gone that he won't even notice what's going on under his own roof. And judging by this evening's performance, I won't have to wait much longer. Emily crossed her arms and glared at him. You're deluded. Darren would never allow it, and I find you repugnant. For once, Walter didn't try to grab her, but his lazy smile was full of menace. Say what you like, but I will make you mine, and soon. He pushed himself away from the wall and strolled away, humming under his breath as terror coursed through Emily's veins. I can't put up with this for much longer, she thought with anguish. With trembling hands, she rushed into her bedroom and dragged a chair to wedge behind the door. She was furious with herself for the effect Walter had on her, but also chilled to the core that she could do nothing to stop his unwanted advances. Lord, please protect me. Her prayer was short and desperate. She lay on her bed, fully clothed, too afraid to get into her nightgown, and knew that sleep would be a long time coming. Chapter 12. After a fitful night of shallow sleep filled with bad dreams, Emily jerked awake. Her mind turned to the previous night's altercation with Walter, and she sighed heavily before doing her best to put it out of her mind. The chores still needed doing, no matter how much his repulsive behavior was worrying her. She lit a candle and hastily splashed water on her face, brushed her hair, and secured it neatly into a bun on the nape of her neck. The routine calmed her, and she stood at the window for a few moments after opening the drapes. Even though it was barely dawn and the stars were just fading in the morning light, Ben was busy carrying water for the cattle in the corral. He swung the 2 buckets with ease, and she smiled as the cattle mooed and wandered toward him. One of them butted the fence after he had tipped the water into their trough, wanting a scratch, and Ben obliged. Just as she was about to leave the window, he turned and looked directly toward it. Even from a distance, she could see his smile, and the way he tipped his hat made her heart beat a little faster. He had told her once that he always liked to watch out for her candle in the window so that he knew she was up for the day. The thought gave her a warm glow, so she waved back and was rewarded with an even broader smile. She started to hum happily as she hurried downstairs to head to the kitchen to begin her chores. Walter might think she was terrified of him, but he couldn't stop the pleasure she got from Ben's kind heart. As she neared the kitchen, she was surprised to see the glow of candlelight in the crack of the doorway into Darren's study. It was tempting to tiptoe past and hope he hadn't heard her, but curiosity got the better of her. He's never up this early. Did he stay up all night working? She knew that sometimes he fell asleep by the fire, and decency made her push the door slowly open to see if he wanted a hot coffee or a blanket over his knees. The first thing she noticed was how cold the room felt. The fire had long since gone out, and the only light in the room was from a single candle, which had almost burnt down to a mere stump. "Darren, are you okay?" she whispered. The last thing she wanted was to wake Audrey earlier than her usual hour. Otherwise, she would be in a bad mood all day. She tiptoed further into the room, and her blood ran cold. Darren was slumped to the side in his favorite wingback armchair, and the whiskey on the ornate wooden table next to his chair sat untouched. His face was as white and immobile as the remaining wax of the candle, and his lips were tinged with blue. She gasped, and her hands flew to her mouth to stifle a cry. Emily knew without even touching him that he was dead. "Lord, in your mercy, may his soul rest in peace." She gently placed her fingers against his cheek and confirmed her suspicions before stumbling backwards out of the room again. A moment later, Emily tapped on Audrey's bedroom door. "Mrs. Hudson, wake up! What's all this dreadful racket?" Audrey looked affronted as she snatched the door open and glared at Emily. "It's barely daybreak. I hope you're not going to tell me you've run out of sugar or some trifling concern like last time." Emily shook her head sorrowfully. No matter what she thought of Audrey, this news would hit her hard. "Audrey, I am so sorry, but Darren is still in his study, and he's—" She lowered her eyes and told Audrey shakily of her eldest son's passing. "Pull yourself together, girl. I've never heard anything so ridiculous in all my life. What do you mean? He was perfectly fine when I went to bed last night." Anger and fear flashed across Audrey's face, and she reached for her velvet robe. "It's true." Emily's voice wavered. "He must have passed away in the night. I pray that he wasn't in any pain." Audrey's face changed right before Emily's eyes, the anger turning to deep sadness in a flash as she burst into tears and pushed past her to go to the study to see for herself. "What on earth is going on out here?" Walter demanded as he emerged from his room along the hallway. Only his nightshirt covered him, and she saw him smirk as she glanced down in shock at his bare legs. "Your brother is in his study. He has passed away in his sleep." Emily explained quickly, not as gently as she had for his mother. Walter's expression did not change, as his mother's had, and all he did was stare at her for a moment before shaking his head and giving a small shrug. "This was always going to happen," he mumbled under his breath. "Darren was his own worst enemy, and I knew his bad habits would catch up with him sooner or later. I tried to tell you he was drinking too much." To her shock, Walter's mouth curled up at the corners into a thin smile. "He made his own choices, and he only has himself to blame. It's happened a little sooner than I expected, but perhaps the timing is just right." "What a wicked thing to say," Emily blurted out. She turned to leave, but he stepped in front of her. "I am the head of the family now," he said in a low voice so only they would hear it. "I've been in Darren's shadow for too long, and there are going to be some changes around here soon. Mighty soon." He gave her a lewd wink before strolling down the stairs after his mother. Her stomach churned, and for a moment she wondered if she might be sick. She had long suspected Walter cared little for Darren, but to see it so brazenly displayed was shocking and distasteful. As soon as her legs would allow her to move again, she returned to the study and joined Audrey and Walter by Darren's side. Walter had laid Darren on the floor, so Emily respectfully covered him with the rug from the chair. "Thank you," Audrey nodded through her sobs, which let Emily know that she had done the right thing. "What can I do, Audrey? How can I help?" Emily spoke to her mother-in-law gently. "Go and inform Ben and the other ranch hands," Audrey said, her voice still shaky. "Someone needs to go and fetch the pastor, and we need to prepare for the burial next to where his father is laid to rest out back. It will take some time because of this wretched snow, but I want everything done properly for my dear son." Fresh tears trickled down Audrey's lined cheeks, and Emily squeezed her arm in sympathy. She didn't care much for the family, but she empathized with a woman who clearly loved her husband and her son dearly. As she hurried away, Walter leaned out from the study and shouted after her, "Put some coffee on before you go. If we're to be dealing with all this at such an ungodly hour, We must still have sustenance. Once the coffee was warming and she had put fresh bread and jam out, Emily pulled on her boots and overcoat and opened the door to a rush of cold air. It snapped her out of the shock of her discovery, and she crunched across the snow-covered barnyard, her mind whirling. Emily kept expecting sadness and grief to crash over her at any moment, but it didn't come. Is it wrong of me? Does that make me a terrible wife? She was ashamed to admit to herself that the only feeling was one of relief that she would no longer be married to Darren. It had been a loveless marriage in name only. She felt pity for Audrey for losing her sooner than she should have done, and in such a way, but for Emily, it was a blessing in disguise. She would be free from the Hudson family and their unreasonable demands. Emily briefly considered what her future might hold with this change of circumstance, with a wave of overwhelming worry and fear of where she might go next. But she quickly pushed it from her mind and decided that it wouldn't be proper of her to think about that until after her husband's funeral. She was a woman of strong faith and knew she had to do the right thing for her husband. To give him a heartfelt farewell and lay him to rest with his father once more. She could worry about her future after that. Chapter 13. Just 3 days after she had discovered Darren had passed away in his dark and gloomy study, Emily stood at the graveside and lowered her eyes as he was laid to rest. The ranch hands were respectful as they lowered the expensive coffin Audrey had selected into the ground, but there were no outpourings of sorrow for the passing of their boss. He had been a hard man to work for. The wind bit sharply at her ankles, and instead of beauty, the snow and ice lent an air of bleakness to the day. Audrey looked frail, as though she had aged 10 years in the past few days, and her eyes were red-rimmed from the tears she had shed daily since Darren's unexpected demise. A fresh flurry of snow started falling from the gray sky, so Emily offered Audrey her arm to support her as they walked together to the edge of the grave. "I'm fine," Audrey muttered, shrugging Emily's hand away. The old lady shot her a stern look from under her black bonnet, which reminded Emily that nothing had changed about their relationship just because Darren was gone. Walter thrust his hands in his pockets and offered no help or support to his mother, standing beside her with what seemed to be indifference to the situation. The same pastor who had married her and Darren just a few short months ago spoke solemnly, sharing a few words as the coffin was lowered into the grave, and the ranch hands stepped back and took their hats off. "Farewell, brother. Rest in peace," Walter murmured. He picked up some dirt from the side of the grave and threw it in, seemingly without much thought, and without noticing Audrey wince as the frozen clods clattered on the wooden coffin lid. "Carry on. It's too cold to stand out here any longer." His instructions were curt, and the ranch hands picked up their tools to shovel the soil back into the hole. Emily stood for a moment while Ben led the other men in the task and used the silence to say a prayer for the family in her head. "Dear Lord, please help Audrey and Walter at this time to come to terms with the passing of their son and brother and have acceptance and peace. Help them to find a way through this and to go on to live their lives with faith and compassion for others. I pray for Darren, who lost his life far too young to the wretched habit of drink, and I pray that others may be released from this all too common curse. Please bless this ranch with kindness and grace as everyone goes through the changes that will take place now that Darren has gone and Walter takes on the running of the ranch. Thank you, Lord, for guiding me always, and I put my trust and faith in you to show me the path ahead." As Emily walked back to the house following Audrey and Walter, she was deep in thought until a red-breasted robin caught her attention as it fluttered and hopped in the snow near the chicken coop, pecking at old bits of corn. The sight of something so simple and ordinary lifted her spirits, and she suddenly noticed Ben was standing nearby with his blue eyes fixed on her. She caught his eye and saw a hint of a smile, and Emily felt butterflies in her stomach as she realized what today meant. She was a widow now, and free from Darren's ties. The thought was both shocking and liberating, and caught her so off guard that she stumbled on the snowy ruts under her feet and had to drag her gaze away from Ben so she could be more careful on the rest of her route to the house. In spite of the somberness of the day, her thoughts seemed to have a life of their own and took her on a dizzy dance of dreaming about a life with Ben, far away from Oak Ranch. "Emily, why are you taking so long to walk to the house?" Audrey's sharp question brought her back to her reality with a jolt. She might have become free from Darren, but she was still beholden to her mother-in-law and Walter. "I'd like coffee in my parlor, and then you can make a start on lunch," Audrey continued, giving her a suspicious glance. An hour later, Emily carried a tureen of ham and vegetable soup to the dining room and placed it in the center of the table next to the bread she had baked fresh that morning and a platter of cheese with cold meat and pickles. "It's good to see you haven't let grief dull your sense of duty," Walter said cheerily as she served his bowl of soup first. "I'm still cold from being outside, so this should warm me up nicely." Emily was stuck for words and mumbled a reply before serving Audrey and then taking her seat to join them. Darren's empty chair was impossible to ignore, and when Walter put his spoon aside after his first few mouthfuls, she wondered whether his appetite had deserted him. Perhaps he did care more for his brother than she'd given him credit for. "So, what are your plans now that you are a widow, Emily?" he asked abruptly. His voice sounded loud and assertive as he took on the mantle of authority as the man of the house. Emily cast around for the right answer that wouldn't make her sound ungrateful. She hadn't had much time to consider her options yet, and with no money to her name, she wasn't sure what she would do. "Should I tell them I want to leave?" Today of all days? Audrey looked at her expectantly, and Emily decided to ask the older woman for help. "I would appreciate being guided by you on this, Audrey, if you don't mind?" she asked tentatively, to which the older woman looked confused. "You have also been a widow, so perhaps you could help me a little. I could go and look for work in Crooked Hill, but it would need to be something with the chance to live in. Maybe you could put in a good word with some of your acquaintances. I sure would appreciate it." It was a bold move to ask for the woman's help, but Emily hoped to appeal to her better nature. Her hopes were soon dashed as she saw a strange look pass between Audrey and Walter. "It would be most inconvenient for us if you were to leave now," Audrey said firmly. "The chance of finding a new cook and housekeeper to take over your chores is impossible. Nobody is looking for work outside of town at this time of the year." There was no warmth in her small eyes, just irritation. "Well, I don't want to inconvenience you, but my circumstances have changed, and I must leave as soon as possible." Walter coughed sharply, interrupting her, and leaned forward in his chair, looking at her and then his mother. "I've given it some thought and made my decision. After Christmas, when a respectable amount of time for mourning has passed, I will call the pastor back, and he will marry us, Emily." He turned to Audrey and patted her hand. "Darren would have wanted what was best for this family, and it is hard to get good workers, so I am confident he would not have minded." "No," Emily jumped to her feet, knocking her chair over. Her eyes filled with tears for the first time that day. "I cannot marry Walter," she pleaded with Audrey. "It wouldn't be right after losing Darren." "What would he care now that he's gone?" Walter drawled, giving her a triumphant smile. Audrey just shook her head and waved her concerns away as though she was being childish. "It's none of my business, Emily. If Walter wants you as his wife, and that means you stay to continue with the cooking and upkeep of the house, then he has my blessing." She pressed her thin lips together with an air of finality that made Emily's heart sink. "I really am very tired. I think I shall retire to my room for a while." Emily watched aghast and lost for words as Audrey stood up and left the dining room. "Don't act so surprised," Walter said with a chuckle. "You must have realized this is what I wanted all along." "I don't love you, and I never will," Emily cried angrily. She put her hands on her hips, desperate to make him understand. "What you're suggesting isn't right. I'd rather leave and take my chances in Crooked Hill than be married to you." Walter shrugged and filled his glass with whiskey before raising it to her in a sickening toast. He smirked at her over the top of the glass before confirming her worst fears with his next words. "Unlike my brother, I expect a proper marriage. We will share a bedroom and we will have a family." He stated it firmly, with the clear expectation that there would be no further discussion about her future. He had decided, and she must accept. Emily rushed out of the dining room, excusing herself to go and do the dishes and clean up the kitchen after lunch. She had thought her situation couldn't get any worse. How wrong she had been. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she dashed them away, feeling a hard ball of resentment growing in her chest. This was not the time to indulge in self-pity. She had to dig deep and pray for God to show her a different path, and that she would have the strength to take it. Being married to Darren had been hard enough, but Walter was cruel, and she knew his demands would be unrelenting. I have to do something, and fast. She paced back and forth in the kitchen, her thoughts whirling like the snowflakes outside. There was only one person who might be able to help her, and that was Ben. She decided to wait until nightfall, and then she would creep across to the barn and ask him for his advice. Chapter 14. Emily lay wide awake and fully clothed, watching the moonlight track across the floorboards in her bedroom. It was only when she heard the muffled chime of 2 o'clock in the morning from the grandfather clock downstairs that she trusted everyone was asleep, and it was safe for her to go ahead with her plan. She eased herself out of bed and pulled on her boots before wrapping her warmest shawl around her shoulders. She then tiptoed out of her room and down the stairs and let herself out of the kitchen door. The stars were bright in the inky sky, with only a few wisps of thin cloud, and she ran across the snowy ground toward the barn, where she expected Ben would be sleeping by that hour. But he was not asleep, and no sooner had she lifted the latch on the heavy barn door than he swung it open, ushering her in silently and closing the door quickly again. She had never been in the barn at night, and she was taken aback by the warm scent of hay and the lamplight, which created a cozy welcome, like a warm cocoon. It felt so much more comforting than the grand homestead that she felt the stress start to ease from her tense muscles immediately and let out a long sigh. "I've been waiting for you and watching the house," Ben said simply. "I didn't know who else to turn to. But it could only be you," she thought. Emily realized that it wasn't the barn that made her feel at home. It was being in Ben's company. Something terrible has happened. Ben took one look at her distraught face and folded her into a comforting embrace. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Emily felt safe and cherished in the circle of his strong arms, and tears welled up in her eyes in spite of her determination to be strong. He stepped back and held her at arm's length, his hands gently resting on her shoulders as he searched her eyes to understand what was going on. "Can you tell me? I can't begin to imagine what you must be feeling. But now that you are a widow, I guess you will be on your way soon?" Worry was etched on his face. "I wouldn't blame you, but I'll miss you more than you will ever know." "That's just it," she cried as she rushed back into his arms and rested her head against his broad chest for another moment. "I may be free of Darren, but I'll never be free of this family." She shuddered slightly as she stepped away again so she could see his face. "What do you mean?" Alarm crossed Ben's handsome features. "Walter told me at lunch today that he intends for me to marry him, so I'll stay as their cook and housekeeper." She grimaced as the conversation came flooding back. His own brother barely cold in the ground, and Walter said he wants to be a real husband with a shared bedroom and to have a family. She gasped and shook her head with a low moan. "I can't, Ben. I simply can't. I hate him." Ben's expression hardened in the lamplight and his jaw clenched. "No," he ground out. "I could not bear to see you married to that man. It was bad enough with Darren, but at least his worst fault was just being a lazy drunk. Walter is cruel and heartless. He will make your life miserable, and you deserve so much better." He broke away from Emily and prowled around the barn like a mountain lion sizing up its prey. "Did he say when?" "As soon as Christmas is over." She gave a hollow laugh. "He wants a small period of mourning to be observed, just for appearances. But he made no secret of the fact that this was his intention all along. There must be something I can do to help you. We have to get you far away from Oak Ranch." "I agree, but I have no money because I haven't been paid a penny for all the work I have done for the Hudsons, and I came west with virtually nothing. All I have is what I brought with me from New York." She felt a wave of desolation at how trapped she was and looked down at her boots. And how can I leave if it means there are some things, I mean people, I would miss? She added in a whisper. Ben stopped pacing and walked slowly toward her, with a mixture of emotions chasing across his face. Taking a deep breath, he lifted her head gently with his finger under her chin and looked deep into her eyes. I've wanted to say this for so long, but you were married to my cousin, so I couldn't. Yes? Emily's heart skipped a beat. I can't offer you riches or a life of luxury, and I don't know if I have any prospects outside of this ranch, but I do know that I love you with all of my heart, and I have done ever since I first met you off the train. He stopped and glanced down, taking both of her hands in his. Would you consider running away with me? Tonight, we could start a new life together. Emily's heart soared with joy, and she smiled up at him shyly. I've had feelings for you too, Ben, but I didn't dare say a word while I was married to Darren. It wouldn't have been right or proper. His eyes lit up with happiness, and she felt a blush steal up her cheeks as she realized the true implications of what he had just revealed. I prayed about it and thought that loving a man who wasn't my husband was very wrong. But also, I asked God to show me a path out of my terrible life in the big house. A sense of peace and optimism stole over her. Nothing had ever felt so right in her life as being with Ben. I don't care about money, she cried happily. All I have ever wanted is to be with a kind-hearted and good man who works hard. That man is you, Ben, she exclaimed. Several of the horses looked over their stall gates and snickered, making them both laugh. I'm glad you feel the same way, Ben said, suddenly serious again. I can't bear to lose you. Not now I've discovered the woman I love. He cupped her face gently, and their lips met in a dizzyingly tender moment that made her head spin. You'll never lose me, Emily murmured. A vision of Walter and what his enraged reaction to this news would be like slipped into her mind, and she frowned. He was not a man who liked to be thwarted, and his anger would know no bounds. Ben knew exactly what she was thinking and became more businesslike. If we are going to leave, we have to do it right now while they are sleeping, he said urgently. Tomorrow will be too late. If Walter gets an inkling of our feelings for each other, I don't trust that he could behave within the law. Emily nodded her agreement. She knew exactly what kind of man Walter was, and she wouldn't put it past him to drag the pastor to the ranch the very next morning to marry them now that he had his mother's blessing. The sooner she could get away, the better. I'll go and pack now. It won't take me a moment. Ben pulled her into another embrace, his face etched with worry. Don't take any risks. If you think either of them is awake, run straight back here, so I can keep you safe, my love. Emily's heart was in her throat as she crept back to her bedroom and packed her carpet bag as quietly as she could. Straining her ears, she was grateful for the whiskey Walter had drunk in the evening, and she could hear the rhythmical rise and fall of his deep snores as she tiptoed back down the stairs a few minutes later, running away again. She thought back to when she had left her father and felt a pang of sadness that she had departed in such a way. She promised herself she would write to him once she was settled somewhere. She grabbed some stale bread rolls from the pantry, then ran across the barnyard to join Ben again. He had saddled his horse and packed some saddlebags with a few belongings. It wasn't much, but they would manage. Are you sure about this? Emily asked. It means leaving behind everything you've worked so hard for and your family. I've never been more sure of anything. He grinned in the moonlight and kissed her again. We'll have to take it steady with only one horse. I paid for this with my own money, but if I took one of the ranch horses, Walter would probably say it was theft and put a bounty on our heads. Better to leave with no ties and no need for him to come after us. He swung himself up into the saddle and then lifted Emily up to sit in front of him. As the horse began to walk, Emily glanced back at the impressive house as it receded in the darkness. She shuddered at the memories she had from being there. Ready? Ben murmured against her hair. She nodded silently and leaned back against his chest. In the distance, a fox barked, and an owl swooped in front of them as though to guide their path. It would be hours before sunrise, and Emily prayed it would be long enough to give them a clean getaway before their absence was noticed. "Where will we go?" she asked once the homestead had receded into the distance behind them. "Rocky River," Ben replied confidently. "It's a small town further west. Crooked Hill is the first place Walter will think to look, so I think Rocky River will be safer." "I don't mind where it is, as long as we're together," she said happily. The owl hooted in the silent black night, and before long, more snow clouds had blanked out the moon, and snow started to fall again. Although the terrain was rough because Ben was avoiding the obvious route off the ranch, the horse was sure-footed. "Thank goodness the snow will cover our tracks." Emily knew that once again the Lord had answered her prayers, that he would guide them through this journey and keep them safe. "Thank you, Lord, for saving me in my hour of need." Her prayer was simple but heartfelt. There might be hard times ahead, but she had faith in her heart and the love of a good man. It was more than enough. Their week-long journey was arduous, but with every additional mile put between them and Oak Ranch, Emily felt the knot of anxiety in her chest start to loosen. The nights were colder than she had ever experienced, but Ben somehow managed to turn the long miles into something bearable, even fun. They stopped before darkness fell to gather wood, then sat cozily next to the campfire, watching the flames crackle in hues of orange and blue before sleeping under a makeshift shelter of an old leather hide stretched over sticks. The fire kept the wolves at bay, although Emily still shivered when she heard their mournful howls long into the night. And Ben was the perfect gentleman, which only made her love him more. It would have been easy to be tempted into romance, but he was too well-mannered for that, wanting instead to make sure that Emily didn't go hungry and never felt afraid. He would never do anything to make her feel uncomfortable or sully her reputation, unlike Walter. He snared rabbits, and they eked out the beans he'd packed to go with the stale bread Emily had brought from the ranch. As the days passed, they both felt weak, hungry, cold, and exhausted, but neither had ever been so happy or felt so free. "I still find myself listening to every sound, wondering if Walter will come riding into our camp," she confessed to Ben a week later. "The fresh snow has obliterated our tracks," he reassured her, turning rabbit meat on a wooden spit over the fire. "To be honest, I think Walter's idleness will work in our favor as well. He'll be angry, for sure, but not enough to put himself through the discomfort of being out in this weather." Emily's fear slowly dissipated, and their talk turned to the future. She told him about her job in the bakery back in 5 Points and that she hoped something similar might be available for her in Rocky River. And Ben explained that he intended to look for work on a ranch, but that he would do anything he could turn his hand to. "It seems like we're very similar," he commented as the embers of the fire glowed, and he put another log on to see them through the night. "We're both seeking honest work, a friendly community to be part of, and a place to call home." "It sounds perfect," Emily agreed. "Rocky River isn't much further. By my reckoning, we should get there tomorrow." Ben looked thoughtful in the firelight and turned to take Emily's hand in his own. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that I will take good care of you." A flash of independence rippled through her before she could stop it. "I don't expect you to do all of the work. I want to earn my keep too. I wasn't raised to expect much from others, and you have your own dreams to follow." Ben laughed easily. "Some folks might call you stubborn, but I like to think of it as your determined streak," he chuckled. "It's what I admired in you from the day I fetched you from the station, and it's what's gotten you through all the challenges you've faced." He shot her a mischievous look. "I hope our children will be just as determined in the future." Emily's heart fluttered as he leaned forward to push the log further into the fire and settle for the night. Was that a proposal? Tiredness crept up on her, and she yawned as she pulled the blanket over her on what was probably going to be their last night in the wilderness. As sleep claimed her, she heard his deep voice murmur one more thing that made her heart swell with happiness. "I love you, Emily, and when the time is right, I will give you a proper marriage proposal, and with your blessing, we will become husband and wife. I can't offer you much, but together we will work it out." Chapter 15. The horse's head drooped with weariness as they finally reached the edge of Rocky River. Ben quickly dismounted, and the horse's ears pricked up again. He seemed to know it was the end of their journey. "Look," Emily said, pointing toward a charming, snow-covered building with smoke drifting up from the chimney. "The Rosebush Inn. Perhaps they will be able to provide food and shelter." Her voice trailed off as she remembered it would cost money. "I know what you're thinking." Ben pulled some coins from his pocket and held them up. "I saved these especially to pay for a room for you for 2 nights. That should be long enough for us to recover from the journey and make a plan. I'll be fine sleeping in the stable to keep costs down." Emily slid off the saddle and put her hands on her hips. "I'm not having you waste your last few coins on my comfort, Ben, even if it is very thoughtful of you." Before they could continue, a man strolled out and gave them a jovial smile. "I couldn't help but overhear what you just said. How long have you been traveling for?" As soon as Ben told him, he hurried forward to shake their hands. "I'm Eli Perez. I run the Rosebush with my wife, Suzanne. We're not full up at the moment, so I'm sure we can do you 2 rooms for a very reasonable rate, what with you looking so exhausted." Before Emily could demur, Eli had called for a stable boy to untack the horse and give it hay and water in the stables. Then he ushered them inside to meet his wife. "You poor things," Suzanne clucked, bustling to meet them. "You must sit by the fire and have some hot food right away, no charge." Somehow, she didn't need to ask what sort of ordeal they had been through, but seemed to know by sixth sense. She took their sodden coats away to dry and gave them the best table in front of the hearth, where the fire crackled merrily. "Thank you so much," Emily murmured, feeling emotional. "It's been a long while since anyone has shown such generosity." "You'll find folks are friendly here in Rocky River," Suzanne replied. "I hope you'll be staying and settling here. We need more young couples like you. And if anyone comes looking," she shrugged, "I'm sure they won't," she finished. Emily stretched out her feet toward the fire and felt sleepy as the steam rose from her gown as it dried. "I think this looks like a wonderful little town to find work, don't you?" she asked Ben. He returned her smile, even though he had dark circles of exhaustion under his eyes. "The Lord is on our side, Emily. I truly believe that. Otherwise, what else could explain people like Mr. and Mrs. Perez showing such kindness to us? We'll get a good night's sleep, and I'll start looking for work first thing tomorrow." Emily felt a pang of guilt as she entered the dining room at the Rosebush Inn the following morning because it was already daylight outside. It was the first time in years she'd slept so late, but Suzanne gave her a broad smile and showed her to a table in the window. "I didn't call you to get up. Reckoned you could use a good night's sleep, and there was nothing to rush for." "Thank you. It was blissful. The most comfortable bed I've ever slept in." Emily didn't feel so bad when she noticed that there were still plenty of folks eating breakfast. It was just that she'd gotten so used to being up hours before the Hudsons to get her chores done. "Your fine young gentleman was up bright and early, though." Suzanne poured a steaming cup of coffee out for her. "Oh, we're not married or engaged," Emily corrected her hastily with a blush. "Not yet, you mean?" Suzanne's eyes twinkled. "He told me he wanted to make a good start on looking for work so he could pay for a few more nights staying here." Eli overheard as he carried an armful of logs in for the fire and came to stand by Emily's table. "He'll go far, your young gentleman," he chimed in. "There's always work for a strapping man like him with a good work ethic. He'll find something before sundown, I reckon." Emily sipped the reviving coffee and decided Suzanne and Eli wouldn't mind helping her a little more. "Speaking of work, I'm going to head out myself after breakfast to look for a job." She gave the dining room an admiring look. "As lovely as it is here, I'm not used to being idle. I've always paid my way in life, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "Of course. What sort of position are you looking for?" Suzanne paused from clearing the nearby table, eager to share her local knowledge. "Were you a maid or governess, perhaps?" "No." Emily shook her head, determined not to get sucked back into a position like she'd had working for Darren. "I used to work in a bakery back east for a good few years. The owner said I was good at it, but I don't have a reference from him, unfortunately." Suzanne and Eli exchanged a glance and smiled at each other. A bakery, huh? Eli said, winking at his wife. Suzanne pulled out the chair next to Emily and gave her an earnest look. If that's true, it's perfect timing. She nudged Eli. Didn't I say the Lord would deliver if we prayed on it? Eli nodded before walking away to help an elderly customer stand up from her table, and Suzanne continued. We recently decided we would like to expand the business so that we offer bread and cakes. The town is getting busier, and he thinks they would sell well, but we're already so busy. We knew we needed to have help, and Eli is no baker. Would you like the position? You could try it out for a few days and see if you like it. If it works out, we can pay you a good wage and include your board and lodging. Really? Emily couldn't believe her luck. It would take the pressure off Ben and give her a way to earn her keep while he found his feet in the new town. Sure, Suzanne beamed back at her. It would be helping us out, and I can already tell you'll fit in well in Rocky River. In that case, thank you. I'd love to do your baking. Emily sighed happily as she tucked into her breakfast, looking forward to Ben's return so she could tell him her good news. Ben took his hat off and raked a hand through his hair before stepping into the mercantile store. The bell tinkled on the door, and he strode up to the counter with an air of determination. He had been up since before dawn, excited to start his new life in Rocky River, and so far, what he'd seen of the town didn't disappoint. It was larger than Crooked Hill, but still had the vibrant energy of a growing frontier town that filled him with optimism. Plenty of opportunities for a hard-working ranch hand, Eli had called cheerfully after him as he'd checked his horse in the stables first thing. I expect you'll want to make inquiries yourself, but I'm happy to make introductions to a few folks as well if you want me to. As Ben approached the counter, he smiled inwardly. Eli was right. This was something he wanted to do himself, if he could, as a way of proving to Emily that he could take care of her. A warm glow spread through his chest at the thought of her and gave him courage. He had never felt this way about a woman in his whole life. Everything about her filled him with admiration and delight. Can I help you? The owner of the mercantile wiped his floury hands on his apron and gave Ben a smile, dragging him away from his happy thoughts about Emily. He glanced out through the window as the sun started to dip over the rooftops. The days were short, and it wouldn't be long until nightfall. I sure hope so. Ben leaned over the counter and shook hands. I'm new in town, staying at the Rosebush Inn for a few days, but I figure the person in the mercantile always knows what's what. Uh-huh. Not much gets past me and my wife, the jovial man agreed. Looking for work, are you? That's what most folks ask about when they arrive. Yes. Ben shot the man a wry smile, wondering if it was that obvious. It was against his nature to boast about his achievements, but he also knew this was no time to be shy about what he could do. I'm a ranch hand, he explained. I learned what I could from my pa before he passed, and I've been running a big ranch over the other side of the mountains for well over 10 years. He cleared his throat and plowed on. Breeding cattle and horses is what I love doing, and we usually fetch the highest prices at Crooked Hill cattle sales. Once he'd gotten on his favorite subject, he chatted away for a bit longer about the merits of different cattle as the store owner nodded to encourage him. That sounds good. The mercantile owner raised his eyebrows curiously. I suppose some folks would want to know why you left the job behind. His question hung in the air, not unkindly, but out of interest, and Ben gripped his hat, not quite knowing how to answer. It was my cousin's ranch, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. I guess I just wanted a chance to strike out on my own instead of only working for him. Quite right, too, and who could blame you? The woman's voice behind him startled Ben, and he spun around to see twinkling eyes under gray hair and an old lady smiling up at him. Good to make your acquaintance, she continued, reaching out to shake hands. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and Ben realized she was dressed more like a ranch hand than an elderly lady. You too? He smiled. I'm Joyce Brooker, and I hope you won't think I was listening in to your conversation, but I couldn't help but overhear that you are looking for work. I sure am. If you happen to know of anyone who needs a ranch hand, I can start immediately. Ben realized he sounded desperate and didn't want to create the wrong impression. What I mean is that I'm eager for the right kind of work. Someone who needs an experienced cattleman who can work unsupervised. I've been doing this most of my life. Joyce nodded slowly and gave him an appraising look. Uh-huh. I can recognize a good worker when I see one, and I happen to be looking for someone to help on my small ranch just outside of town. You most likely passed it on your way in, she added proudly. You won't find a better person to work for than Joyce, the mercantile owner said as he returned from his storeroom with an armful of packages. Ben gave silent thanks to the Lord for once again coming to his help. That's a wonderful coincidence, Mrs. Brooker, she smiled again. Or perhaps God meant for our paths to cross? I'm happy to give you a week's trial. She delved into her coat pocket and pressed some coins into his hand. A gesture of good faith, and that should cover a couple more nights at the Rosebush. Are you sure? Ben was shocked at how decisive she was, but grateful for her faith in him. I don't want to risk you working for someone else, she chuckled. Come to my ranch for sunrise tomorrow morning, and I can tell you more about my plans. I used to manage by myself, but old age has made it harder, and I have to accept I'm not as strong as I used to be. You won't regret it, Ben said happily. What about your shopping? He eyed the mound of supplies the mercantile owner was gathering for her. Will you let me carry them out for you? Did you come with a wagon? Why, that would be most helpful. Joyce went to select a few more items, and Ben waited discreetly by the door, marveling at how quickly his fortunes had changed. He thought about how lovely it would be to be a part of such a tight-knit community where everyone helped their neighbors. It was exactly what he and Emily had said they hoped for as they'd talked about the future on their journey. And he could already tell that Joyce was the sort of person who would value his work and knowledge. It would make a welcome change from the way his family had treated him with such careless disdain all these years. His only regret was whether the animals he had left behind would be properly cared for, but he couldn't let guilt eat him up. Perhaps it will do Walter good to get out and do some work himself. Maybe that's where we all went wrong, letting him take the easy option all the time. Ready when you are, Joyce called. As they loaded up her wagon, Ben couldn't resist telling her about Emily. She already felt like an old friend, and he realized he wanted his new employer to know everything. I came here with a very special woman, he confided. If I'm to work for you, Mrs. Brooker, I want you to know more about my circumstances. She was married to my cousin, but he treated her very badly, and when he passed away, I helped her escape. Joyce gave him a shrewd look. And you love her, I can see. It was a statement, not a question. Ben nodded. More than that, I hope to marry her soon. He paused, feeling the warm glow in his chest again. I've never met anyone as wonderful as Emily, but I needed to be sure I could find work and provide for her first. Maybe in the spring would be a good time. Once she's gotten settled and used to being in Rocky River. Why wait, young man? Joyce chuckled and patted his arm. There's no time like the present. Why don't you book the pastor for Christmas Eve? Imagine how romantic it would be. You think? He was shocked at her directness. If anything, he'd expected Joyce to discourage him, wanting his focus to be solely on his work at her ranch. But now that she'd mentioned it, he couldn't get the idea out of his mind. We never know what's around the corner in life, she said, suddenly more serious. If you love each other, I'm sure the Lord would want you to be married. She climbed nimbly into her wagon and picked up the reins, patting the seat beside her. I could use a hot cup of coffee before heading home. How about we go to the Rosebush now, and you can introduce us and tell her your news about finding work. Chapter 16. Emily had insisted she should do some chores for Suzanne to help her out until Ben got back, and she stood outside the front of the inn shaking her duster, enjoying the crisp winter day. It had stopped snowing, and she could hear cheery voices and laughter from further down the street as folks ventured out to go about their business. The sound of a horse trotting caught her attention, and she was surprised to see Ben sitting in the approaching wagon next to a gray-haired woman who held the reins. Her heart lifted with happiness, and she stuffed the duster in her apron pocket and ran to the front gate to meet them. "You'll never guess what?" she cried. "I have good news." Ben jumped down and hurried to her side. I've got news as well, but you go first. Suzanne and Eli have offered me work, baking bread and cakes for the inn. Ben hugged her. You never cease to amaze me, Emily. He went to offer his hand to help the woman down from the wagon, but she waved him away. This is Joyce Brooker, he said, making the introductions. And this is Emily. Emily shook hands with her, and Suzanne came bustling out. Joyce, I see you've already met Ben. Eli was going to suggest he should speak with you about work. It's already taken care of, Joyce said airily. He starts on my ranch tomorrow, and I count myself lucky that we bumped into one another in the mercantile. Is it true? Emily felt excitement bubble up in her chest. We've both found work already? I think this calls for a celebratory coffee and slice of cake, Suzanne declared. Come and sit by the fire. The next hour passed in a blur of conversation as Joyce got to know Emily better. And Suzanne and Eli started telling them more about who everyone was in Rocky River and a little history of the place. She found herself stealing glances at Ben and daring to hope that this could be the wonderful new future they both longed for. When there was a lull in the conversation, Joyce gave Ben a straight look and glanced toward the door. Could you do me a favor, Ben? She asked with a twinkle in her eye. Just pop outside and check that my horse is okay. I'll be heading off soon. Perhaps you should take Emily with you. Suzanne and I need to discuss a bit of business. Emily was glad to stretch her legs again and was starting to feel guilty for sitting idle for so long, so she jumped up and followed Ben outside happily. I can't believe so much has changed in such a short time, Ben said. I like Rocky River already, and we've only been here one night. Everyone is so friendly and helpful. Emily shivered and pulled her shawl tighter, which didn't go unnoticed by Ben. You're cold? He reached out and held her hands, looking deep into her eyes. Emily, I don't know exactly what my job will be like on Joyce's ranch, but I have a feeling she's a kind-hearted woman who wants the best for us. Emily's pulse quickened as his blue eyes crinkled at the corners. I never doubted for one moment that you'd find work as soon as we arrived, and I agree. She seems kind and straight-talking. It will be a refreshing change. She already told me she's looking forward to seeing you improve her herd. She hesitated for a moment. I know you'll be busy with work, but I'm very glad you'll still be near town. I've gotten used to your company, Ben, and I'll miss you, but I understand your work must come first. Ben shook his head and pulled Emily closer, wrapping his arms around her. Love comes first, Emily, and I love you so much I don't want us to be apart anymore. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Could we marry before Christmas? Emily gasped with joy and nodded, scarcely able to find the right words. Ben tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow, and they carried on walking toward the church. By the time they arrived, the sky had turned inky blue, and the first stars were just starting to come out. Wood smoke drifted in the air, and Emily knew she would remember this day for the rest of her life. I'm glad we came here together, she said simply. Ben paused at the church gate and looked at her with nothing but love in his eyes. So am I, Emily, my Christmas rose. We went through hard times, but I truly believe the Lord meant for us to find each other. The pastor opened the church door and greeted them with a beaming smile. It was almost as though he'd been expecting them, and Emily knew with sudden certainty that the old woman's predictions would come true. They would be blessed with children to love and cherish as they grew up, and she would write to her pa at the earliest opportunity to tell him her good news and hope that one day he might consider coming out west to join them. Here's to our first Christmas together, she whispered to Ben as the pastor took them into the church. A sense of peace enveloped her, and outside, fresh snowflakes started to drift down. The first of many, he whispered back, squeezing her hand. Epilogue. 2 years later. Emily gave the log cabin one last glance to check that everything was to her satisfaction. The meat was roasting in the range, and the potatoes would go in shortly to finish crisping up. She already had several bowls of vegetables warming on the stove, and the scent of cinnamon and sweet spices from the rich plum pudding wafted through the house. She added another log to the fire and straightened up again. The Christmas tree in the corner of the room with its glossy blue-green pine needles, was decorated with tinsel and baubles that sparkled as they caught the light. There was just one last thing to do. She crossed the room to the dresser and tucked her Christmas rose into a small vase, placing it at the center of the shelf. It was hard to believe 2 whole years had passed since the day the old woman had given her that rose, but she treasured it, even though the petals were now faded and papery dry with time. Catching sight of her reflection in the mirror next to the dresser, Emily paused for a moment and felt a pang of unexpected sadness. She could see both her parents in her features, and her thoughts turned to her pa, making her sigh. Emily had been writing to Isaac ever since her wedding 2 years ago on Christmas Eve. It had been going so well. As the months passed, Emily discovered that her pa had stopped drinking completely and found a new job as a clerk. Not only that, but he had also started going to church again. And best of all, he had a new companion. A widowed lady called Charlotte, who he wrote about in glowing terms, saying how much she had helped him realize he needed to turn away from the evils of hard liquor. To start with, he had been hesitant to mention Charlotte in his letters, worrying that Emily would not approve. But she had reassured him many times that she was happy he had found love again, and that it didn't detract in any way from the love he'd had for her ma. She sighed again and glanced fretfully toward the little wooden box where she kept Isaac's letters. Her sadness stemmed from the fact that they had abruptly stopped coming a month ago. She tried to tell herself it was just because of the winter snow holding up the mail, but it was no good. She had seen other letters being delivered around Rocky River, so she feared it was because her pa had either gotten ill or no longer cared enough to carry on writing to her. She hadn't shared her worries with Ben, but she decided she would in the new year. They didn't keep secrets, and she knew he would want to reassure her. The sound of high-pitched giggling outside pulled Emily from her troubled thoughts, and she gave herself a mental shake. It was Christmas Day. Not a time to dwell on her worries, but rather to be grateful for everything she had in her life. She went to the front door of the cozy log cabin and smiled as she stepped out onto the veranda. Ben had lifted their daughter, Mary Louise, onto his shoulders, and he was stomping through the snow, bouncing her up and down. "We're playing a game," he cried cheerfully. "Mary Louise has already helped me check on the animals, and they've all been fed and watered. The only thing left to do now is enjoy our Christmas dinner together." Emily's heart melted with happiness as she watched the two of them. Mary Louise had the same dark blonde hair as Ben, and she had not long started toddling on plump legs with great determination since she had turned 1 year old in the fall. Across the barnyard, she could see Joyce brushing snow from the steps of her log cabin. She lifted her arm and waved to the old woman who had become such a dear friend to them, far more than an employer. Joyce had already told them firmly that when it was her time to return to the Lord in heaven, she was leaving the ranch to Ben because he was doing so well with it. "Are you going to come across and join us now, Joyce? Dinner is nearly ready, and you know Mary Louise won't be happy unless you're here with us." "I'll be with you shortly," Joyce called back. She paused for a moment and shaded her eyes against the low winter sun, looking down the drive. "I'm just waiting for something." Emily wondered briefly what Joyce was waiting for, but before she had a chance to ask Ben, the sound of a horse clopping through the snow caught her attention. It was a horse and wagon, turning off the main road from Rocky River onto the track leading up to Joyce's ranch. "Who could that be?" she said as Ben came to join her on the veranda. "Joyce didn't mention there would be any visitors coming out to the ranch today. It's a good thing I've prepared far more food than the 4 of us need." Ben lifted Mary Louise down from his shoulders, and she reached her arms toward Emily, so she settled the little girl on her hip. "I owe you an apology," Ben said in his deep voice. His blue eyes crinkled with amusement at the corners as he smiled down at her. "Joyce and I invited extra folks for Christmas dinner, but we wanted it to be a surprise." Emily shook her head and chuckled. "There's no need to apologize. You know I love to welcome people to our home. Is it some new folks from town?" She had always vowed that she would help newcomers settle in at Rocky River in gratitude for the way that they had been made to feel so welcome when they first arrived 2 years ago. In a manner of speaking, Ben said mysteriously. Emily watched as the horse and wagon rolled into the barnyard and came to a stop. She gasped with shock as she realized the man holding the reins was none other than her pa, and the plump, gray-haired woman next to him must be Charlotte. Pa? Is it really you and Charlotte come all this way for Christmas, or am I dreaming? The man who jumped down from the wagon and ran toward her was no longer paunchy and haggard with red-veined cheeks, the way he had been when she left 5 Points. His hair was neatly cut, and his complexion was clear again, just like how she remembered him from when she was younger. He held open his arms and laughed joyfully. Yes, Emily, it's us. And I think I must be the happiest man in Wyoming today to see my beautiful daughter and her new family. His eyes misted with emotion, and he suddenly looked nervous. I hope you can forgive me for the way I treated you in the past. Charlotte has helped me become a better person, the sort of man I hope your ma would have approved of. Without hesitation, Emily embraced her father, with tears of happiness rolling down her cheeks. Ben hurried to the wagon to help Charlotte down, and Joyce stood nearby with a delighted smile on her face. How long have you been in Rocky River? Emily looked between Ben and her father. Are you just visiting for Christmas, or can you stay longer? Charlotte cooed over Mary Louise, and then tucked her hand into the crook of Isaac's elbow, looking up at him proudly. Your pa was determined not to miss out on seeing his grandchildren growing up. We've been staying at the Rosebush Inn for the last few nights, but we hope to settle in town. I've already found a job at the feed mill, doing their books, and Eli has found us a quaint little house at the edge of town. Isaac suddenly looked hesitant and took Emily's hand. We wanted it to be a surprise, which is why I haven't written any letters to you these last few weeks. I wouldn't have been able to keep it from you. But it's up to you, Emily. If you don't want us to intrude on your new life, we'll understand. Emily sighed happily as she looked around at all the people she loved most in the world and shook her head. This is the best Christmas present I could ever have wished for, she said joyfully. I always hoped you might come west and join us, but I never mentioned it because it seemed too much to ask. You won't regret moving here, Ben said to their visitors. Emily and I have never been happier than since we came here, thanks to Joyce's welcome, and the same from so many other folks who are now our friends and neighbors. A flurry of fresh snowflakes started to fall from the sky, and Mary Louise babbled excitedly. I think we should all go inside and start our Christmas celebrations, Emily announced as she opened the cabin door, and they all trooped inside. The fire crackled invitingly in the hearth, and the candles cast a cozy glow over the decorations. Welcome to our home, Emily said softly. Ben slipped his arm around her waist and brushed a kiss on the top of her head. Merry Christmas, everyone. May the Lord bless us all, and may we always be grateful to have one another. Emily leaned against her husband, the man she loved so much, and smiled up into his blue eyes. There had been so many times she had dreamed of this moment, and now it had come true. It truly was the best Christmas ever. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gilchrist writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.